Welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. Tonight we descend deeper into the rhythm of documentation, where every crime becomes a carefully crafted report, every incident transformed into the measured language of official record. Let yourself sink into the gentle cadence of police work at its most methodical, where stories find their rest in the precise formatting of departmental protocols. The report writing room on the third floor of the central precinct had witnessed the creation of thousands upon thousands of documents over the decades, each one following the same careful template that transformed the chaos of human experience into the orderly language of law enforcement. Detective Thomas Walsh had spent more hours in this room than he cared to calculate, his fingers finding their familiar rhythm on the keys of the department-issued typewriter that had become as natural to him as breathing. Tonight, like so many nights before, he sat before the pale green screen of the computer terminal that had replaced the typewriter just 2 years earlier, though he still missed the satisfying mechanical precision of those older machines. The cursor blinked steadily in the upper left corner of the screen, waiting for him to begin transforming another human drama into the careful prose that would become part of the permanent record. The case before him was typical in its complexity, involving what the initial call had described as a domestic disturbance, but which had evolved, through the patient work of investigation, into something far more nuanced. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez had called the police to report that her adult son was threatening her. But when Officer Patricia Kim had arrived at the small apartment on Maple Street, she had found a situation that required more understanding than enforcement. Detective Walsh began with the standard heading that appeared at the top of every report he had written over his 15-year career. Case number, date, time of initial call, responding officers, location, and the basic classification that would determine how the incident was cataloged in the department's vast filing system. These elements formed the skeleton upon which the flesh of narrative would be carefully arranged, creating a document that would serve multiple purposes over the years to come. The initial response section described Officer Kim's arrival at 847 Maple Street, apartment 2B, at approximately 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in October. The building was one of those post-war constructions that had housed working families for decades, its narrow hallways and thin walls creating an environment where neighbors inevitably became involved in each other's lives. Whether they wanted to or not, Officer Kim had found Mrs. Vasquez, age 73, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had grown cold while she waited for police to arrive. Her son Michael, age 46, was pacing in the living room of the small apartment, his movements agitated but not immediately threatening. The apartment itself bore no signs of violence or struggle, though Officer Kim noted the general atmosphere of tension that seemed to permeate the space. Detective Walsh typed slowly, allowing each sentence to capture not just the facts of what Officer Kim had observed, but the subtle details that painted a fuller picture of the situation. Mrs. Vasquez had been well dressed, despite the early afternoon hour, her hair carefully arranged and her makeup applied with the precision of someone who took pride in her appearance, even when she had no plans to leave her apartment. Her hands had shaken slightly as she held her coffee cup, though whether from age, medication, or stress was not immediately apparent. Michael Vasquez had been wearing work clothes, the kind of dark pants and button-down shirt that suggested employment in an office or retail environment. His face had shown signs of sleeplessness, with dark circles under his eyes and the slightly unfocused look of someone operating under significant stress. When Officer Kim had asked him to explain what had happened, his words had come in a rush of frustration and concern that took several minutes to untangle into a coherent narrative. Report continued with a detailed account of the interviews Officer Kim had conducted with both mother and son, each conversation documented with the kind of precision that would allow anyone reading the report months or years later to understand not just what had been said, but the emotional context in which those words had been spoken. Mrs. Vasquez had explained that her son had moved back into her apartment 6 months earlier, following the dissolution of his marriage and the loss of his previous job. She had welcomed him initially, grateful for the companionship and assistance with household tasks that had become more difficult as she aged. However, she had grown increasingly concerned about his behavior over the past several weeks. Michael had been staying awake most of the night, pacing through the small apartment and talking to himself in ways that disturbed her sleep and made her worry about his mental state. He had been making phone calls at unusual hours, conversations that she could hear through the thin walls, but could not quite understand. Most troubling to her, he'd begun expressing paranoid thoughts about former colleagues and neighbors, suggesting that people were watching him or talking about him in ways that seemed unrealistic to her. The report included Mrs. Vasquez's exact words, captured in the careful quotation marks that Officer Kim had used to preserve the emotional texture of her concerns. She had described her son as becoming someone she did not recognize, still the caring person who helped her with groceries and household repairs, but also someone who seemed to be living in a different reality from the one she inhabited. Michael's interview had been more challenging to document, requiring Officer Kim to navigate between his agitated state and the need to understand his perspective on the situation. His account of recent events had included elements that were clearly factual, mixed with interpretations that seemed influenced by sleep deprivation and stress. He had lost his job 3 weeks earlier. He explained, not because of performance issues, but because his supervisor had been building a case against him based on false information provided by jealous colleagues. The report carefully distinguished between Michael's statements about objective facts, such as the date of his termination and the reason given by his employer, and his interpretations of the motivations and actions of others. Officer Kim had verified the basic facts through a phone call to Michael's former employer, confirming that he had indeed been terminated, but for reasons related to attendance and performance rather than the conspiracy he had described. Detective Walsh found himself admiring the careful way Officer Kim had documented this distinction without dismissing Michael's genuine distress or making him feel that his concerns were being trivialized. The report reflected her understanding that people experiencing mental health crises often mixed valid observations with distorted interpretations, requiring responders to separate the factual elements from the emotional or psychological components. The documentation continued with Officer Kim's assessment of the immediate situation and her recommendations for addressing both the short-term safety concerns that had prompted the call and the longer-term issues that were creating ongoing tension in the household. She had determined that Michael posed no immediate threat to his mother or himself, but that his mental state warranted professional evaluation and possible intervention, rather than treating the incident as a simple domestic disturbance requiring immediate resolution through arrest or removal. Officer Kim had approached it as a family crisis requiring coordination with mental health and social service resources. Her report documented the phone calls she had made from the apartment, connecting the family with a crisis counselor who could provide immediate telephone support and schedule an appointment for more comprehensive evaluation. Asterisk. She had also worked with both mother and son to establish what she called a safety plan, a set of agreements about how they would handle Michael's symptoms while he waited for professional help. Mrs. Vasquez would feel free to call police again if she felt unsafe, but she would also try to understand that her son's suspicious thoughts were symptoms of illness rather than accurate perceptions of reality. Michael agreed to see a doctor within the next few days and to try to limit his nighttime pacing to avoid disturbing his mother's sleep. The report included Detailed contact information for the various resources Officer Kim had connected the family with, creating a paper trail that would allow other officers or social workers to follow up on the case without having to start from the beginning. She had also scheduled a follow-up visit for the end of the week, recognizing that complex family situations rarely resolve themselves after a single intervention. Detective Walsh paused in his typing to consider the thoroughness with which Officer Kim had approached what could have been handled as a routine call. Her report demonstrated the kind of comprehensive thinking that transformed police work from simple law enforcement into a form of community care, addressing not just immediate problems, but the underlying conditions that created those problems. The follow-up section of the report documented Officer Kim's return visit 3 days later, finding a household that had achieved a more stable equilibrium through the interventions she had arranged. Michael had seen a doctor and been prescribed medication for what was diagnosed as an anxiety disorder exacerbated by the stress of unemployment and divorce. Mrs. Vasquez had connected with a support group for family members of people experiencing mental health challenges, giving her both practical advice and emotional support for her situation. More importantly, the family had begun to understand Michael's recent behavior as a medical issue rather than a character flaw or personal failing, allowing them to approach it with compassion rather than anger or fear. The report noted that Michael had begun sleeping more regular hours and that his paranoid thoughts had decreased in frequency and intensity since beginning treatment. Officer Kim had concluded her documentation by noting that the case illustrated the importance of approaching domestic disturbances with an understanding of the complex factors that often underlie family conflicts. Her patient work had prevented what could have escalated into a more serious crisis, while also connecting a vulnerable family with resources that would serve them well beyond the immediate incident. Detective Walsh saved this section of the report and moved on to another case that required documentation, this one involving what had initially appeared to be a simple theft, but had evolved into a more complex situation involving economic desperation and community support. The case had begun when the manager of Peterson's hardware store had called to report that an elderly customer had been observed shoplifting small items over a period of several weeks. The responding officer, Sergeant Maria Santos, had approached the situation with the kind of careful observation that characterized the best police work. Rather than simply arresting the suspect, she had taken time to understand the context of the behavior and the circumstances that might have led to it. Her report began with a detailed description of Mr. Harold Peterson, age 79, who had been a regular customer at the hardware store for more than 20 years. Mr. Peterson had been observed taking small items like screws, washers, and electrical fuses, never anything expensive, but always items that suggested ongoing home maintenance needs. The store manager had initially been reluctant to report the thefts, both because of Mr. Peterson's long history as a customer and because the total value of the missing items was quite small. However, the pattern had continued long enough to create concern about other customers who might observe the behavior and assume that shoplifting was tolerated. Sergeant Santos had interviewed Mr. Peterson with the kind of respectful patience that her reports always reflected, recognizing that elderly people often faced complex challenges that younger officers might not immediately understand. Her documentation captured not just his admission of the thefts, but his explanation of the circumstances that had led to them, creating a fuller picture of the situation than a simple arrest report would have provided. Mr. Peterson's wife had been dealing with a serious illness that required expensive medications not fully covered by their insurance. Their fixed income, adequate for normal living expenses, had been stretched beyond its limits by these unexpected medical costs. Rather than asking for help, which he considered a sign of weakness or failure, Mr. Peterson had begun taking small items from the hardware store to avoid spending money on home maintenance supplies. The report documented Sergeant Santos's recognition that prosecuting a 79-year-old man for stealing a few dollars worth of hardware supplies would serve no useful purpose, while potentially creating additional hardships for a family already struggling with serious challenges. Instead, she had worked with the store manager to develop what they called a community solution to the problem. The hardware store had agreed to establish what they called a senior citizen credit program, allowing longtime customers experiencing temporary financial difficulties to receive necessary items with the understanding that payment would be arranged when their situations improved. Mr. Peterson had become the first participant in this program, receiving the items he needed for home maintenance, while maintaining his dignity and his relationship with the store, where he had shopped for decades. Sergeant Santos had also connected the Peterson family with local social service agencies that could provide assistance with medication costs and other expenses related to Mrs. Peterson's illness. Her report included detailed documentation of these referrals, creating a record that would allow other officers or social workers to follow up on the family situation and ensure that they continued to receive appropriate support. The case file concluded with a letter from the store manager, written several months after the incident, reporting that the Senior Citizen Credit Program had been successful not only in preventing further thefts, but in strengthening relationships between the store and elderly customers who appreciated having a safety net during difficult times. Several other local businesses had adopted similar programs after learning about the hardware store's success. Detective Walsh found himself impressed by the creativity and compassion that Sergeant Santos had brought to what could have been handled as a straightforward criminal matter. Her approach had transformed a potential prosecution into an opportunity for community building, addressing the underlying economic pressures that had created the problem while also strengthening the social networks that help communities care for their most vulnerable members. These reports represented more than just documentation of police work. They were records of the countless small acts of understanding and creativity that maintained the social fabric of community life. Each case required officers to serve not just as law enforcers but as social workers, counselors, mediators, and community organizers, roles that demanded skills far beyond traditional police training. The next report Detective Walsh reviewed dealt with a vandalism case that had required weeks of patient investigation to resolve satisfactorily. Someone had been spray painting messages on the walls of the downtown library, always working at night, always leaving behind cryptic phrases that seemed to reference local history and current events in ways that puzzled both librarians and police. Detective Jennifer Cole had been assigned to investigate the vandalism, approaching it not as a simple matter of property damage, but as a puzzle that required understanding both the messages themselves and the motivations of whoever was creating them. Her reports reflected the methodical approach she had taken, documenting each instance of vandalism with photographs and careful analysis of the content and style of the messages. The vandal had been using high-quality spray paint in colors that complemented rather than clashed with the library's brick exterior, suggesting someone with artistic training and an eye for visual composition. The messages themselves had been carefully lettered, using fonts and spacing that made them easily readable rather than simply defacing the building with random graffiti. More intriguingly, the content of the messages suggested someone with deep knowledge of local history and current civic issues. References to forgotten political scandals from the 1960s appeared alongside commentary on current zoning disputes and school board controversies, creating a kind of historical dialogue that connected past and present in ways that demonstrated considerable research and thought. Detective Cole had approached the investigation by trying to understand not just who was creating these messages, but why they felt compelled to communicate in this particular way. Her reports documented extensive interviews with librarians, local historians, and community activists who might have insights into the historical references being made or the current issues being addressed. The breakthrough had come through what Detective Cole described as literary detective work rather than traditional law enforcement techniques. She had realized that many of the historical references in the messages were quite obscure, suggesting that the vandal was drawing information from sources that were not widely available to the general public. Working with the library's reference staff, Detective Cole had identified several specialized local history collections that contained the kind of detailed information being referenced in the spray-painted messages. By cross-referencing the checkout records for these materials with the dates of the vandalism incidents, she had been able to identify a pattern that led to a specific individual. The vandal turned out to be Dr. Margaret Chun, a retired professor of history who had moved to the city several years earlier to be closer to her adult children. Dr. Chun had been struggling with the transition from an active academic career to retirement, feeling that her knowledge and expertise were no longer valued or needed by the community. The spray-painted messages had been her attempt to share insights about local history and current events that she felt were being overlooked in public discussions about the city's future. She had chosen the library as her canvas because she saw it as the appropriate venue for educational content, even if her method of delivery was unconventional and unauthorized. Detective Cole's report documented her sensitive handling of Dr. Chun's arrest and the creative resolution that had emerged from their conversations about the professor's motivations and needs. Rather than simply processing her through the criminal justice system, Detective Cole had worked with library administration and local civic organizations to channel Dr. Chun's desire to share her knowledge into legitimate educational opportunities. The resolution had included Dr. Chun's agreement to clean and repair any damage caused by her spray painting, along with her participation in a speakers bureau that connected her with local organizations interested in historical presentations about the city's development and political evolution. The library had also invited her to contribute to their local history collection, providing an archive for her research that would be available to future scholars and community members. The case file included correspondence from several civic organizations that had benefited from Dr. Chun's presentations, noting that her deep knowledge of local history had provided valuable context for understanding current political and social issues. The library reported that her contributions to their collection had significantly enhanced their ability to serve researchers and community members interested in local history. Detective Cole had concluded her final report with observations about the importance of understanding the motivations behind unusual crimes, noting that what appeared to be simple vandalism had actually been an attempt by an isolated, elderly person to maintain connection with a community that she feared no longer valued her contributions. The creative resolution had addressed not only the immediate problem of property damage, but also the underlying social isolation that had contributed to the inappropriate behavior. These cases illustrated the complex social dynamics that often underlay seemingly straightforward criminal incidents, requiring officers to serve as community diagnosticians who could identify and address the root causes of problematic behavior rather than simply responding to its symptoms. The careful documentation in these reports provided templates for future officers facing similar situations, preserving institutional knowledge about effective approaches to community policing. Detective Walsh continued his review of cases that demonstrated the evolution of police work from simple law enforcement to comprehensive community support. The next file dealt with a missing person case that had required coordination between multiple agencies and communities to resolve successfully. The case had begun when Mrs. Rose Martinez had called to report that her 16-year-old granddaughter, Jessica, had not returned home from school and was not answering her cell phone. The initial response had been handled by Officer David Park, whose report reflected the careful balance between taking the concern seriously and recognizing that teenage disappearances often resolve themselves within a few hours. Officer Park had conducted a thorough interview with Mrs. Martinez, documenting Jessica's normal routines, her relationships with friends and family members, and any recent changes in behavior that might provide clues about her disappearance. Jessica had been living with her grandmother for the past 2 years, following her parents' divorce and her mother's struggle with addiction issues that had made stable housing difficult to maintain. The interview had revealed that Jessica had been an excellent student and responsible family member, making her sudden disappearance particularly concerning to her grandmother. She had no history of running away or staying out without permission, and she typically called if her plans changed or if she would be late coming home from school activities. Officer Park's report documented his systematic approach to locating Jessica, beginning with calls to her school to confirm her attendance and speaking with teachers about her behavior and mood during the school day. Jessica had attended all her classes and it seemed normal to her teachers, though her best friend had mentioned that she had seemed worried about something during lunch but had not elaborated on the source of her concern. The investigation had expanded to include Jessica's known friends and their families, with Officer Park conducting careful interviews that respected both the privacy concerns of other families and the urgency of locating a missing teenager. His reports reflected the diplomatic skills required to gather information from protective parents, while also ensuring that no relevant details were overlooked. The breakthrough had come through social media research, an increasingly important tool in missing person investigations. Officer Park had worked with the department's technology specialist to review Jessica's social media accounts, discovering recent private messages that revealed she had been in contact with her mother, who had been living in a different state and struggling with the addiction issues that had led to Jessica's placement with her grandmother. Jessica's mother had apparently made contact several weeks earlier, claiming that she had overcome her addiction problems and wanting to re-establish a relationship with her daughter. The messages revealed that Jessica had been conflicted about this contact, wanting to believe that her mother had changed, but also wary of being disappointed again by promises that might not be kept. The final messages indicated that Jessica's mother had asked her to meet at a bus station in a neighboring city, suggesting that she might try to take Jessica back with her without involving the grandmother or the courts that had established Jessica's custody arrangement. Officer Park's report documented his immediate response to this information, including coordination with law enforcement in the neighboring jurisdiction and notification of child protective services about the potential custody violation. Jessica had been located at the bus station, waiting with her mother but clearly conflicted about whether to board a bus that would take her away from the stable home she had found with her grandmother. The reunion between mother and daughter had been emotional but also tense, with Jessica torn between her love for her mother and her realistic assessment of past disappointments. Officer Park's documentation included detailed accounts of the sensitive conversations required to resolve the situation without traumatizing Jessica or completely alienating her mother. Rather than treating the incident as a simple custody violation requiring arrest and prosecution, he had worked with all parties to arrange a meeting that included Jessica's grandmother, her mother, and representatives from family services who could help them develop a plan that considered everyone's needs and Jessica's best interests. The resolution had been complex but ultimately successful, with Jessica's mother agreeing to participate in a supervised reunification program that would allow her to gradually rebuild her relationship with her daughter while Jessica continued living in the stable environment her grandmother provided. The plan included regular meetings, family counseling, and ongoing monitoring to ensure that Jessica's welfare remained the primary consideration. Officer Park's final report noted that the case had required him to serve multiple roles beyond traditional law enforcement, including family mediator, child advocate, and community resource coordinator. His careful documentation provided a template for other officers facing similar situations involving family conflict and child welfare concerns. The case file included follow-up reports documenting the success of the reunification plan, with Jessica maintaining her academic performance and emotional stability. while gradually rebuilding her relationship with her mother under professional supervision. The grandmother had reported feeling more confident about Jessica's long-term stability, knowing that appropriate support systems were in place to monitor the situation and intervene if problems developed. These reports demonstrated the way effective police work often required officers to understand and navigate complex family dynamics, working within existing social service systems to protect vulnerable individuals, while also respecting the rights and needs of all parties involved. The careful documentation preserved not only the facts of each case, but also the decision-making processes and community resources that had contributed to successful resolutions. Detective Walsh completed his review of the evening's cases and began the process of preparing his own reports for filing, ensuring that each incident he had investigated would be documented with the same care and attention to detail that characterized the best police work. The quiet rhythm of typing filled the report room as other officers worked on their own documentation, each one contributing to the vast archive of human experience that law enforcement accumulated in the course of protecting and serving their communities. The reports they created would join the thousands of others already filed in the department's archives, becoming part of the permanent record of how a community dealt with the inevitable conflicts and challenges that arose when people lived together in close proximity. Some of these cases would be referenced again in future investigations or legal proceedings, while others would simply rest quietly in their files, their stories preserved for anyone who might need to understand how patient, thoughtful police work could transform potential crises into opportunities for community healing and growth. As the night progressed and the reports took their final form, each one represented not just the resolution of an immediate problem, but the ongoing effort to maintain the delicate balance of social relationships that made community life possible. The officers whose work was being documented understood that their role extended far beyond simple law enforcement, encompassing the broader responsibility of helping people find ways to live together peacefully and supporting those who needed assistance during their most vulnerable moments. The typewriter keys had fallen silent, but the stories they had captured would echo through decades of quiet filing cabinets, waiting for future readers who needed to understand that police work, at its best, was really about understanding people and helping them navigate the complex challenges of human community. In the careful language of official reports, the drama and complexity of real life had been transformed into documents that would preserve these lessons for generations of officers yet to come. Asterisk. The Archives Division occupied the entire basement level of the old courthouse building, a labyrinthine space of metal shelving and climate-controlled storage that stretched far beyond what any casual visitor might imagine. Librarian Margaret Foster had spent the better part of 3 decades navigating these corridors, her soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper against the polished concrete floors as she moved between sections that chronicled different eras of the city's legal and criminal history. Each section was organized with the meticulous precision that Margaret had inherited from her predecessor, a system so comprehensive and logical that files from any decade could be located within minutes by someone who understood the careful logic underlying the arrangement. The earliest records, dating back to the 1920s, occupied the furthest reaches of the basement, where the original wooden filing cabinets had been preserved as historical artifacts in their own right. Margaret paused at Section J, which housed criminal cases from the 1960s, her fingers trailing along the metal tabs that separated one year from the next. The files here told stories of a city in transition, when traditional neighborhoods were beginning to change and new social challenges were emerging that would reshape the work of law enforcement for decades to come. Each folder contained not just the official records of crimes and investigations, but the accumulated wisdom of officers who had learned to adapt their methods to changing times. She pulled a thick folder marked 1967, juvenile cases, miscellaneous, and settled into the small reading area that had been carved out between the towering shelves. The fluorescent light above cast a steady glow that made the faded typing and handwritten notes clearly legible. Despite the passage of more than 5 decades since these documents had been created, the first case in the folder dealt with what had initially been classified as vandalism but had evolved into something far more complex through the patient investigation of Detective Robert Chun. A series of murals had appeared overnight on the walls of buildings throughout the downtown area, each one depicting scenes from local history rendered in bold, colorful imagery that transformed neglected urban surfaces into unexpected galleries. The artwork had been technically illegal, created without permission on private property, but Detective Chun's reports reflected his recognition that the murals represented something more significant than simple vandalism. The images showed careful research and artistic skill, depicting forgotten moments from the city's past with historical accuracy and emotional depth that suggested serious study. Rather than casual graffiti, Detective Chun had approached the investigation by trying to understand the educational and artistic value of the murals rather than simply focusing on their illegal creation. His reports documented extensive conversations with local historians, art teachers, and community leaders who could help him assess the cultural significance of the work that had appeared so mysteriously throughout the downtown area. The breakthrough had come through what Detective Chun described as community-based detective work, engaging with people who might understand the artistic and historical references embedded in the murals. Several high school teachers had recognized the style and subject matter as consistent with work they had seen from Maria Santos, a 17-year-old student who had shown exceptional talent in both art and history classes. Maria's arrest had been handled with unusual sensitivity, reflecting Detective Chun's understanding that her illegal artwork represented educational passion rather than destructive intent. His reports documented long conversations with Maria about her motivations, revealing that the murals had been her attempt to share local history that she felt was being forgotten as older buildings were demolished and neighborhoods changed. Character. Rather than processing Maria through the juvenile justice system as a vandal, Detective Chun had worked with school administrators and community leaders to channel her artistic talents and historical interests into legitimate educational projects. The resolution had included Maria's agreement to create a series of legal murals for the community center, working with local historians to ensure historical accuracy while developing her artistic skills under professional mentorship. Margaret found herself moved by the thoughtfulness with which Detective Chun had approached what could have been handled as a straightforward case of property damage. His reports demonstrated the kind of creative problem-solving that recognized the difference between destructive behavior and misdirected creativity, finding ways to preserve and redirect talent rather than simply punishing its inappropriate expression. The file included photographs of Maria's completed community center murals, images that had faded over the decades, but still conveyed the energy and vision that had motivated her original illegal artwork. Follow-up reports indicated that Maria had gone on to attend art school and had eventually returned to the city as a professional artist and art teacher, contributing to legitimate public art projects that beautified the community while educating residents about their shared history. Margaret moved to another section of the folder, finding cases that illustrated the complex social dynamics of the 1960s and the challenges facing young people during the period of rapid cultural change. A thick file documented what had been called the Riverside High School incident, a series of conflicts between students from different racial and economic backgrounds that had required careful intervention to prevent escalation into more serious violence. The initial reports described a pattern of increasingly tense encounters between groups of students, manifesting as arguments in hallways, confrontations in the cafeteria, and occasional shoving matches that had begun to worry teachers and administrators. Officer Linda Park, who served as the school's community liaison, had been asked to investigate and recommend interventions that might reduce tensions before they escalated. Further, Officer Park's reports reflected her understanding that the conflicts were symptoms of larger social tensions rather than simple personality clashes between individual students. The city was experiencing demographic changes as new families moved into previously homogeneous neighborhoods, creating situations where young people from different backgrounds were encountering each other for the first time in schools that had not yet developed effective strategies for promoting integration and understanding. Her investigation had involved extensive interviews with students from all the groups involved in the conflicts, documentation that preserved their voices and perspectives in ways that revealed the complexity of their experiences. Students from established families expressed frustration about changes in their school's character and concerns about academic standards, while students from newer families described feeling unwelcome and excluded from school activities and social networks, rather than treating the situation as a law enforcement problem requiring disciplinary action. Officer Park had approached it as an educational challenge that required community-wide solutions. Her reports documented her collaboration with teachers, counselors, and community leaders to develop programs that would help students understand each other's backgrounds and find common ground despite their different experiences. The resolution had been innovative for its time, involving the creation of what was called the Community Understanding Program, which brought together students from different backgrounds to work on shared projects that highlighted their common interests, while also celebrating their diverse perspectives. Officer Park had worked with school administrators to establish discussion groups, cultural exchange activities, and collaborative community service projects that helped students see each other as individuals rather than as representatives of different racial or economic groups. Margaret read through months of follow-up reports documenting the gradual reduction in tensions and the development of genuine friendships between students who had previously viewed each other with suspicion or hostility. The program had been so successful that it had been adopted by other schools in the district, becoming a model for addressing demographic transitions in educational settings. The file contained letters from students who had participated in the program, written years later as adults reflecting on the impact of Officer Park's intervention on their understanding of community and diversity. Several correspondents mentioned that the experience had shaped their career choices, leading them to work in education, social services, or community organizing where they could continue the work of building bridges between different groups of people. These cases from the Tifa 1960s illustrated the way effective police work had evolved to address the changing social challenges of that era, requiring officers to serve as educators, mediators, and community builders in addition to their traditional law enforcement roles. The careful documentation preserved not only the facts of each case, but also the innovative approaches that had proven successful in addressing complex social problems. Margaret moved deeper into the archives, pulling files from the 1970s that documented the department's response to changing patterns of crime and social behavior during that turbulent decade. A particularly thick folder contained reports dealing with what had been called the downtown business district problems, a series of issues related to the influx of young people who had begun gathering in the area during evening hours. Initial reports described concerns from business owners about groups of teenagers and young adults who were congregating in parking lots and vacant storefronts, creating situations that some merchants found intimidating even though no actual crimes were being committed. Detective Michael Rodriguez had been assigned to investigate the situation and recommend appropriate responses to what appeared to be more of a social issue than a criminal problem. Detective Rodriguez's approach had been to spend extensive time in the downtown area during the evening hours when the gatherings occurred, observing the dynamics of the groups and trying to understand what was attracting young people to these particular locations. His reports documented weeks of patient observation, revealing that the gatherings were primarily social in nature, involving young people who had limited other venues for meeting and socializing during evening hours. The area had become popular because it was one of the few places in the city where young people could gather without being asked to leave or make purchases, and where they could socialize across the racial and economic lines that divided other parts of the community. Detective Rodriguez had observed that the groups were generally well behaved, with conflicts being rare and usually resolved through peer pressure rather than requiring outside intervention, rather than trying to disperse the gatherings or arrest people for loitering. Detective Rodriguez had worked with business owners and community leaders to develop what he called a community accommodation approach. His reports documented extensive negotiations between different stakeholders, seeking solutions that would address merchants' concerns while also recognizing young people's legitimate need for safe social spaces. The resolution had involved the establishment of designated areas where young people could gather without interfering with business operations, along with the creation of organized activities and programs that channeled their energy into positive community involvement. Local merchants had agreed to provide part-time employment opportunities for some of the young people, while community organizations had developed evening programs that gave them alternatives to simply hanging around parking lots. Detective Rodriguez had also worked to establish ongoing communication between the different groups, creating a system where concerns could be addressed before they escalated into conflicts. His reports documented regular meetings between business owners, community leaders, and representatives of the young people who gathered downtown, developing a collaborative approach to managing the area that respected everyone's needs and rights. The success of this approach had been documented in follow-up reports showing a significant reduction in complaints about the downtown gatherings, along with increased cooperation between young people and local businesses. Several of the teenagers who had been part of the original groups had eventually found employment with downtown merchants, creating positive relationships that benefited both individuals and the broader community. Margaret found these cases particularly interesting because they demonstrated the evolution of police work toward more collaborative, community-based approaches that sought to address the underlying social needs that often created apparent law enforcement problems. The officers whose work was documented in these files had understood that their role was not simply to enforce rules, but to help communities find ways to accommodate the legitimate needs of all their members. She moved to another section of the archives, focusing on files from the 1980s that documented cases involving economic stress and its impact on community stability. The decade had brought plant closures and economic restructuring that had affected many families, creating new challenges for law enforcement as people struggled to adapt to changing economic realities. One particularly comprehensive file documented what had been called the Elmwood neighborhood crisis, a series of problems that had emerged as unemployment rates rose and families faced foreclosure and displacement. Detective Sarah Kim had been assigned to coordinate the police response to increasing reports of domestic disturbances, property crimes, and other issues that seemed to be related to economic stress rather than traditional criminal behavior. Detective Kim's reports reflected her understanding that many of the incidents requiring police response were symptoms of larger economic problems, rather than isolated criminal acts. Families facing financial crisis were experiencing increased stress that sometimes manifested as domestic conflicts, while the appearance of abandoned properties was creating opportunities for vandalism and other forms of property crime, rather than simply responding to individual incidents as they occurred. Detective Kim had worked to understand the broader patterns that were affecting the neighborhood and to develop comprehensive responses that addressed underlying causes as well as immediate symptoms. Her reports documented extensive collaboration with social service agencies, community organizations, and local government offices to coordinate resources that could help families weather the economic crisis. The approach had involved what Detective Kim called preventive community policing, identifying families and individuals who were at risk of crisis and connecting them with appropriate resources before problems escalated to the point where police intervention became necessary. This had required developing relationships with unemployed workers, families facing foreclosure, and elderly residents who were becoming isolated as their neighbors moved away or withdrew from community activities. Detective Kim had established regular office hours at the community center, providing a location where residents could seek assistance or report concerns without the formal atmosphere of a police station. Her reports documented hundreds of conversations with community members who needed help navigating social service systems, mediating landlord-tenant disputes, or simply finding emotional support during difficult times. The success of this approach had been measured not in arrests or citations, but in the gradual stabilization of the neighborhood as families found the resources they needed to address their economic challenges. Follow-up reports showed decreasing numbers of domestic disturbance calls, reduced property crime, and increased community involvement in maintaining neighborhood stability. The file contained letters from community members expressing gratitude for Detective Kim's patient work during a period when many residents had felt abandoned by government institutions. Several correspondents mentioned that her presence in the neighborhood had helped maintain hope and community solidarity during what could have become a period of complete social breakdown. Margaret moved deeper into the 1980s files, finding cases that illustrated the way drug-related problems had begun to affect communities during that decade and the innovative approaches that some officers had developed for addressing addiction as a public health issue rather than simply a criminal justice matter. A thick folder documented the work of Officer James Martinez in responding to what had initially appeared to be a traditional drug dealing problem in one of the city's residential neighborhoods. The investigation had begun with complaints about increased foot traffic to a particular house and concerns about the behavior of people seen coming and going at all hours of the day and night. Officer Martinez's initial reports described a careful surveillance operation that had revealed a complex situation involving not just drug sales but also what appeared to be an informal treatment and support network for people struggling with addiction. The house in question was being used by a former addict named Robert Chun, who had developed his own approach to helping other addicts achieve sobriety through peer counseling and mutual support. The activities at the house technically violated several laws related to drug possession and unlicensed counseling, but Officer Martinez's reports reflected his recognition that Robert Chun's work was actually serving a legitimate community need in the absence of adequate formal treatment resources. People who came to the house were seeking help with addiction rather than simply buying drugs, and many of them were successfully maintaining sobriety through the support they found there, rather than simply shutting down the operation through arrests and prosecutions. Officer Martinez had worked with public health officials and addiction specialists to understand the value of the peer support that was being provided. and to find ways to legitimize and enhance the work that was already being done effectively but illegally. The resolution had been unprecedented in its recognition that sometimes illegal activities were serving legitimate community needs that were not being met through official channels. Robert Chun had been connected with opportunities to obtain legitimate counseling credentials while continuing his peer support work under professional supervision. And the house had been converted into an officially sanctioned treatment facility. Officer Martinez's final reports documented the success of this approach in reducing drug-related crime in the neighborhood while also providing enhanced treatment resources for people struggling with addiction. The innovative resolution had served as a model for other communities dealing with similar problems, demonstrating that law enforcement could sometimes be most effective by finding ways to support and legitimize community-based solutions rather than simply suppressing illegal activities. Margaret continued her exploration of the archives, finding case after case that illustrated the creativity and compassion that had characterized the best police work over the decades. Each file contained stories of officers who had recognized that their job was not simply to enforce laws, but to help communities address the complex social problems that often manifested as criminal behavior. The files from the 1990s showed the evolution of these approaches as departments began to formalize community policing, strategies that had previously been developed by individual officers working in isolation. A comprehensive folder documented the establishment of what had been called the Community Partnership Program, an initiative that brought together police officers, social workers, educators, and community leaders to address neighborhood problems through coordinated intervention. Detective Lovra Park had been one of the coordinators of this program, and her reports documented the careful planning and implementation that had made it successful. The approach had involved assigning teams of professionals to work together in specific neighborhoods, providing comprehensive responses to problems that required expertise from multiple disciplines. One case documented in detail involved a family whose multiple problems had previously required intervention from several different agencies that had not been coordinating their efforts effectively. The family included elderly grandparents caring for several grandchildren whose parents were dealing with addiction issues, creating a situation that involved child welfare concerns, housing problems, educational challenges, and periodic criminal behavior by the addicted parents. Rather than having each agency respond independently to different aspects of the family's problems, the Community Partnership Program had coordinated a comprehensive response that addressed all the issues simultaneously. Detective Park had worked with social workers to ensure that the children's needs were met while also coordinating with addiction treatment specialists to provide resources for the parents and with housing authorities to stabilize the family's living situation. The success of this approach had been documented in follow-up reports, showing that coordinated intervention had been far more effective than the fragmented responses that had characterized previous efforts to help the family. The children had maintained stable housing and education while their parents received treatment, and the grandparents had received support services that allowed them to continue caring for their grandchildren without becoming overwhelmed by responsibilities beyond their physical and financial capacity. These files demonstrated the evolution of police work toward increasingly sophisticated understanding of the social factors that contributed to crime and disorder, along with the development of collaborative approaches that could address those factors more effectively than traditional law enforcement methods alone. Margaret found herself deeply moved by the dedication and creativity that these archived reports revealed. Story after story of officers who had gone far beyond their basic job requirements to serve as community builders, social workers, mediators, and advocates for people who had nowhere else to turn for help. The careful documentation preserved not only the facts of their cases, but also the wisdom they had gained about effective approaches to serving communities and protecting vulnerable people. As she worked her way through section after section of files, Margaret began to see patterns in the evolution of police work over the decades. From the more traditional law enforcement approaches of earlier eras to the comprehensive community service model that had emerged by the 1990s, each generation of officers had built upon the innovations of their predecessors, developing increasingly sophisticated methods for addressing the complex social problems that manifested in criminal behavior. The archives represented more than just a record of past cases. They were a repository of institutional wisdom about effective approaches to community policing that could inform current and future efforts to maintain public safety while also promoting social justice and community well-being. Every file contained lessons that could be applied to contemporary challenges, demonstrating that the most effective police work had always involved understanding and addressing the underlying social conditions that created crime and disorder. Margaret completed her review of the evening's files and began the careful process of returning them to their proper locations within the vast archival system. Each folder was replaced with the same attention to order and preservation that had characterized her work for 3 decades, ensuring that these stories would remain available for future researchers who needed to understand the evolution of community policing and the accumulated wisdom of officers who had dedicated their careers to serving and protecting their communities. The basement archive stretched away into the darkness beyond the reach of the fluorescent lights, row upon row of shelving that contained the documented history of human community at its most challenging and most hopeful moments. Each file held fragments of lives that had intersected with the criminal justice system, stories of problems solved and relationships restored through the patient work of officers who understood that their job was ultimately about helping people find ways to live together peacefully and support each other during times of crisis. In the quiet sanctuary of the archives, these stories rested peacefully in their careful organization, waiting for the next generation of officers and researchers who would need to understand that effective police work was really about understanding people and communities, about finding creative solutions to complex problems, and about building bridges between different groups of people who shared the common goal of creating safe and healthy communities for everyone. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune overhead, casting their steady glow on the endless rows of files that contained the accumulated wisdom of decades of community service. Margaret made her way back through the corridors of archived memories, knowing that she would return tomorrow to continue the quiet work of preservation and organization that kept these important stories available for anyone who needed to understand the true nature of police work at its most compassionate and effective. The Maple Street neighborhood had existed in relative quiet for more than 4 decades, its tree-lined block serving as home to families who had watched each other's children grow up, celebrated graduations and weddings together, and supported one another through the inevitable challenges that marked the passage of time. Detective Elizabeth Santos had been assigned to this area as part of the department's community policing initiative, spending her days walking the familiar sidewalks and learning the intricate web of relationships that connected these households in ways that were invisible to casual observers. Each house on Maple Street held multiple generations of stories, layers of family history that had accumulated over decades of births, deaths, marriages, and divorces that had reshaped the neighborhood's social landscape countless times. Mrs. Helen Morrison, who had lived at 847 Maple Street for 37 years, served as an unofficial neighborhood historian, her memory containing details about every family that had ever occupied the surrounding homes. Detective Santos often found herself sitting on Mrs. Morrison's front porch during her evening rounds, listening to stories that helped her understand the complex dynamics that shaped community life in ways that had nothing to do with crime statistics or patrol schedules. Mrs. Morrison could explain which families were related by marriage, which neighbors had unresolved disputes dating back decades, and which households were struggling with problems that might eventually require police intervention if appropriate support was not provided. The Morrison house itself had been home to 3 generations of the same family, with Mrs. Morrison caring for her elderly mother while also providing occasional childcare for her daughter's children when work schedules required flexibility. The rhythm of daily life in the house reflected the complex logistics of multi-generational living, with different family members following schedules that had been carefully coordinated to ensure that everyone's needs were met without creating unnecessary stress or conflict. Detective Santos had learned to recognize the signs that indicated when family stress might be building toward crisis, observing changes in routine that suggested underlying problems that had not yet been addressed directly. When Mrs. Morrison's mother began wandering away from the house at night, for example, Detective Santos had been able to connect the family with resources for dementia care before the wandering created safety concerns or neighborhood complaints. The situation had required careful coordination between family members who had different ideas about appropriate care for an elderly person with declining cognitive function. Mrs. Morrison's brother, who lived across town, believed that their mother should be placed in a nursing facility, while Mrs. Morrison wanted to continue caring for her at home with additional support services. Their disagreements had begun to create tension that was affecting the entire household, including the grandchildren who were confused and frightened by the arguments they overheard. Detective Santos had approached the situation not as a law enforcement matter, but as a family crisis that required mediation and resource coordination. She had arranged meetings with representatives from the county's Aging Services Department, helping the family understand the range of options available for supporting elderly people with dementia while also addressing the taza, practical and emotional needs of family caregivers. The resolution had involved a comprehensive care plan that allowed Mrs. Morrison's mother to remain at home during the day with professional supervision, while spending several nights each week at an adult daycare facility that provided specialized programming for people with dementia. The arrangement had given Mrs. Morrison the respite she needed to maintain her own health while also providing her mother with appropriate stimulation and care. More importantly, the process had helped Mrs. Morrison and her brother work through their disagreements about their mother's care, finding a solution that respected both their mother's preference to remain in familiar surroundings and the family's need for professional support. Detective Santos had facilitated several family meetings that allowed everyone to express their concerns and work together to develop a plan that addressed practical needs while also maintaining family relationships. The case had become a model for how community policing could address family crises before they escalated into situations requiring emergency intervention. Detective Santos had documented her approach in reports that served as templates for other officers facing similar situations involving elderly care and family conflict, demonstrating that early intervention and resource coordination could prevent many problems from reaching crisis levels. Across the street from the Morrison house, the Chun family had been dealing with their own complex situation involving their teenage daughter Amy, whose academic performance had begun to decline as she struggled with the social pressures of high school and the expectations of parents who had immigrated to the United States, specifically to provide better educational opportunities for their children. Detective Santos had become involved when Amy had been caught shoplifting small items from a local store, behavior that was completely out of character for a student who had previously been an honor roll student and model citizen. The store manager had called police, expecting a straightforward juvenile arrest, but Detective Santos had recognized that Amy's behavior was likely a symptom of larger problems that required understanding rather than punishment. Her investigation had revealed that Amy was struggling with what psychologists called cultural identity conflicts, feeling pressure to excel academically while also wanting to fit in with peers. who had very different family expectations and social opportunities. The stress had been manifesting in anxiety and depression that Amy had been hiding from her parents, who interpreted her declining grades as laziness or disrespect rather than symptoms of emotional distress. Detective Santos had worked with the school counseling department and local social service agencies to arrange family counseling that helped Amy's parents understand the psychological challenges facing immigrant children who were trying to navigate between their family's cultural values and the social expectations of their American peers. The process had been delicate, requiring sensitivity to cultural differences while also addressing Amy's immediate need for emotional support. The shoplifting incident had been resolved through community service that connected Amy with volunteer opportunities at local organizations serving immigrant families, giving her a chance to use her bilingual skills and cultural knowledge to help other families facing similar challenges. The experience had helped Amy develop a stronger sense of identity and purpose, while also demonstrating to her parents that her struggles were not uncommon among children from immigrant families. Follow-up reports documented Amy's gradual improvement in both academic performance and emotional stability, as she developed coping strategies for managing the cultural pressures she faced. Her parents had also benefited from the counseling process, gaining a better understanding of their daughter's experience and learning ways to provide support that respected both their cultural values and Amy's need to develop her own identity as an American teenager. The success of this intervention had led to the development of specialized programs for immigrant families, dealing with intergenerational conflicts and cultural adaptation issues. Detective Santos had worked with community organizations to establish support groups that brought together parents and teenagers facing similar challenges, creating opportunities for mutual understanding and resource sharing. Further down Maple Street, the Rodriguez household had been affected by economic pressures that were becoming increasingly common throughout the neighborhood as factory closures and business relocations reduced employment opportunities for working-class families. Maria Rodriguez had been working 2 part-time jobs to support her family after her husband's injury had left him unable to continue his work in construction, creating stress that was affecting every member of the household. Detective Santos had first encountered the family when neighbors called to report loud arguments that seemed to be escalating toward potential violence. Her initial response had revealed a family in crisis due to financial stress rather than any history of domestic violence, with arguments arising from frustration about their economic situation rather than personal conflicts between family members. Rather than treating the situation as a domestic disturbance requiring immediate enforcement action, Detective Santos had worked to understand the economic pressures that were creating stress in the household and to connect the family with resources that might address the underlying causes of their problems. She had arranged meetings with representatives from unemployment services, worker retraining programs, and emergency financial assistance agencies. The intervention had also involved working with Mr. Rodriguez to help him understand that his injury-related disability was not a personal failure, but a medical condition that required appropriate treatment and accommodation. His depression about his inability to provide for his family had been affecting his relationships with his wife and children, creating additional stress in an already difficult situation. Detective Santos had connected Mr. Rodriguez with counseling services that specialized in helping people adjust to disability, while also exploring retraining opportunities that would allow him to work in fields that did not require the physical capabilities that his injury had affected. The process had taken several months, but had eventually led to his enrollment in a computer training program that prepared him for office work that accommodated his physical limitations. Mrs. Rodriguez had also benefited from connections to job training programs that allowed her to develop skills for better paying employment, reducing the family's financial stress while also giving her opportunities for professional development that enhanced her sense of personal accomplishment. The children had been connected with after-school programs that provided homework help and recreational activities, while their parents were working or attending training sessions. The comprehensive approach had transformed a family crisis into an opportunity for growth and development, with all family members eventually achieving greater stability and satisfaction than they had experienced before the fa economic pressures that had initially created their problems. Detective Santos had documented the intervention as an example of how community policing could address economic stress before it escalated into more serious social problems. The Rodriguez case had also led to the development of neighborhood-wide programming aimed at helping families cope with economic transitions and job losses that were affecting multiple households simultaneously. Detective Santos had worked with community organizations to establish job search support groups, financial planning workshops, and child care cooperatives that allowed families to share resources during difficult periods. At the far end of Maple Street, the Washington household had been dealing with intergenerational conflicts that reflected broader social changes affecting African American families throughout the city. Mrs. Sarah Washington, who had raised her children during the civil rights era with strong emphasis on education and professional achievement, was struggling to understand her grandson Marcus, whose teenage rebellion was taking forms that worried her about his future prospects and personal safety. Detective Santos had become involved when Marcus had been caught with a group of friends who were suspected of tagging abandoned buildings with graffiti, behavior that Mrs. Washington viewed as completely inconsistent with the family values she had worked to instill in all her grandchildren. The incident had created significant tension in the household, with Mrs. Washington feeling that her authority was being challenged and Marcus feeling that his grandmother did not understand the social pressures he faced as a young black man in contemporary society. The investigation had revealed that Marcus's involvement with graffiti was actually part of a broader interest in art and social commentary, with his illegal tagging representing his attempt to express frustration about racial inequality and social justice issues that he felt were not being adequately addressed through conventional political channels. His artwork, while illegally placed, demonstrated considerable artistic skill and social awareness that suggested positive potential if it could be channeled appropriately. Detective Santos had worked with local art organizations and community centers to provide Marcus with legal opportunities to express his artistic and political interests, connecting him with mentorship programs that brought together young artists with established professionals who could guide their development while also helping them understand appropriate venues for social commentary and artistic expression. The intervention had also involved family counseling that helped Mrs. Washington and Marcus bridge the generational gap that had been creating conflict in their relationship. Mrs. Washington had grown up during a period when success for African Americans required careful adherence to mainstream social expectations, while Marcus was coming of age during a time when young black men were developing new forms of cultural and political expression that challenged traditional approaches to racial advancement. The counseling process had helped both grandmother and grandson understand each other's perspectives while also working together to find ways that Marcus could pursue his interests in art and social activism without jeopardizing his educational opportunities or creating legal problems. Mrs. Washington had come to appreciate the artistic quality and social significance of Marcus's work, while Marcus had gained understanding of his grandmother's concerns about his future and her desire to protect him from potential negative consequences of his choices. The resolution had included Marcus's enrollment in a summer arts program that combined artistic training with community service, giving him opportunities to create legal murals and other public art projects that addressed social justice themes while also developing his technical skills and professional contacts. Mrs. Washington had become involved as a volunteer with the program, sharing her knowledge of African American history and civil rights, activism with young artists who were exploring similar themes in their work. The success of this intervention had led to expanded programming that brought together older and younger members of the African American community to explore how different generations could work together to address ongoing issues of racial inequality while also respecting the different approaches and perspectives that each generation brought to social activism. These cases from Maple Street illustrated the complex ways that family relationships intersected with broader social issues, requiring police officers to serve as mediators, counselors, and resource coordinators in addition to their traditional law enforcement roles. Detective Santos had developed expertise in understanding family dynamics and community resources that went far beyond conventional police training. Learning to recognize the signs of family stress and to intervene before problems escalated into crises requiring emergency response. Her work on Maple Street had also demonstrated the importance of understanding neighborhoods as complex social systems where individual family problems were often connected to broader economic, cultural, and social factors that affected multiple households simultaneously. Effective community policing required officers to understand these connections and to develop comprehensive approaches that addressed underlying causes rather than simply responding to immediate symptoms. The relationships that Detective Santos had built with families throughout the neighborhood had created a network of trust and communication that made it possible to address problems early, before they required formal law enforcement intervention. Residents felt comfortable approaching her with concerns about family members, neighbors, or community issues, knowing that she would respond with understanding and appropriate resources rather than simply looking for violations to prosecute. This approach had created a positive cycle where successful interventions with individual families had enhanced community trust in police services, making residents more likely to seek help early when problems were developing rather than waiting until situations reached crisis levels that required emergency response. The neighborhood had become safer and more stable, not through increased arrests or citations, but through comprehensive support services that addressed the underlying factors that contributed to crime and social disorder. Detective Santos had documented her approaches and successes in detailed reports that served as training materials for other officers working in community policing roles, demonstrating that effective neighborhood patrol required skills in social work, counseling, mediation, and resource coordination that complemented traditional law enforcement training. Her work had become a model for community policing programs throughout the department, showing that officers who took time to understand family and neighborhood dynamics could prevent many problems from escalating into situations requiring arrest and prosecution. The families on Maple Street had developed relationships with Detective Santos that extended far beyond traditional police-community interactions, viewing her as a resource for addressing a wide range of problems that might never have been reported to police under more traditional law enforcement approaches. This trust had created opportunities for early intervention that prevented many situations from developing into serious crimes or family crises. As evening settled over Maple Street, Detective Santos completed her daily rounds with a sense of satisfaction that came not from arrests made or citations issued, but from the quiet knowledge that families throughout the neighborhood were functioning more effectively because of the resources and support she had helped them access. The relationship she had built over months and years of patient community work had created a foundation of trust and communication that made the entire neighborhood more resilient and better able to address problems before they became crises. The stories of these families would continue to unfold over years and decades, with children growing up, parents aging, and new challenges emerging that would require continued attention and support. But the foundation of community connections and resource networks that Detective Santos had helped establish would continue to serve families long after individual problems had been resolved, creating a model of community resilience that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining the essential bonds that held neighborhoods together. In the gentle twilight that settled over Maple Street, the houses held their families with quiet dignity, their windows glowing softly with the warm light of homes, where people had learned to support each other through difficulties and celebrate together during times of joy. The work of community policing continued in these quiet moments, not through dramatic interventions or urgent responses, but through the patient cultivation of relationships and resources that made it possible for families to thrive even when facing significant challenges. The night shift at Central Station began its quiet transformation at 11 o'clock each evening, when the fluorescent lights were dimmed to their softer setting and the building settled into its more contemplative rhythm. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had worked these hours for nearly 8 years, finding in the peaceful atmosphere of night duty a kind of meditation that suited both her temperament and her approach to police work. The dispatch desk took on a different character during these hours, its radio chatter reduced to the essential communications that marked the city's transition from day to night. Calls became less frequent, but often more complex, involving situations that had been building throughout the day and now required the kind of patient attention that was possible when officers were not rushing from one emergency to the next. Sergeant Rodriguez settled into her desk near the main communication center, where she could monitor radio traffic while also attending to the endless flow of paperwork that constituted the foundation of all police work. Each report that crossed her desk represented hours of investigation and documentation, transforming human drama into the careful language that would preserve these stories in the department's permanent records. The first case file she reviewed dealt with a domestic dispute that had been resolved earlier in the day through the patient work of Officer David Kim, whose approach to family conflicts had earned him recognition throughout the department for his ability to de-escalate tense situations and connect families with appropriate resources. The case involved the Henderson family, where teenage rebellion had intersected with parental anxiety in ways that had created a crisis, requiring careful intervention. Officer Kim's report documented his response to a call about a missing 17-year-old who had failed to return home from school, leading to fears that she might have run away or encountered some form of danger. The investigation had revealed that Jessica Henderson had not actually disappeared, but had gone to stay with a friend's family without informing her parents, creating panic that had escalated. When her parents' attempts to contact her had been unsuccessful, the situation had been complicated by recent family tensions related to Jessica's desire to attend college in a different state, a plan that her parents opposed due to both financial concerns and their preference that she remain close to home. The disagreement had been creating ongoing conflict that had made communication between Jessica and her parents increasingly difficult, leading to the kind of misunderstanding that had prompted the missing person report. Officer Kim had approached the situation by working separately with both Jessica and her parents to help each side understand the other's perspective while also addressing the immediate concerns that had created the crisis. His report documented careful conversations that revealed the genuine love and concern that existed within the family despite their current disagreements about Jessica's future plans. The resolution had involved family mediation sessions that helped the Hendersons develop better communication strategies while also exploring realistic options for Jessica's educational goals that could address both her desire for independence and her parents' financial and emotional concerns. Officer Kim had connected the family with college counseling services that helped them understand financial aid options and alternative educational pathways that might meet everyone's needs. Sergeant Rodriguez found herself impressed by the thoroughness with which Officer Kim had documented not just the facts of the case, but also the emotional dynamics that had created the problem and the process by which the family had worked toward resolution. His report served as a template for other officers facing similar situations involving family conflict and adolescent independence issues. The case file included follow-up documentation showing that Jessica had eventually chosen to attend a local college while living at home, a compromise that had allowed her to pursue her educational goals while also addressing her parents' concerns about finances and family cohesion. The experience had strengthened communication within the family and had given them strategies for addressing future disagreements before they escalated into crises. Sergeant Rodriguez moved to another case that illustrated the way seemingly minor incidents could reveal complex social dynamics requiring careful attention and creative problem solving. Detective Linda Park had investigated what had initially been reported as a shoplifting case, but had evolved into something far more nuanced through her patient attention to the circumstances surrounding the incident. The case involved Mrs. Eleanor Wong, a 74-year-old widow who had been observed taking small food items from a local grocery store without paying for them. The store manager had been reluctant to call police, both because of Mrs. Wong's age and because she had been a loyal customer for many years. But the pattern had continued long enough to create concerns about other customers who might observe the behavior. Detective Park's investigation had revealed that Mrs. Wong's shoplifting was not motivated by poverty or criminal intent, but by the early stages of dementia that were causing confusion about social expectations and appropriate behavior. Her family had not yet recognized the symptoms as signs of cognitive decline, interpreting her occasional confusion and forgetfulness as normal effects of aging rather than indicators of a serious medical condition. The resolution had required delicate coordination between law enforcement, medical professionals, and family members to ensure that Mrs. Wong received appropriate care while also addressing the immediate concerns that had led to the shoplifting reports. Detective Park had arranged for medical evaluation that confirmed the dementia diagnosis and had helped the family understand the implications of the condition for Mrs. Wong's safety and independence, rather than pursuing criminal charges that would have been inappropriate given Mrs. Wong's medical condition. Detective Park had worked with the grocery store manager to develop a monitoring system that allowed Mrs. Wong to continue shopping independently while ensuring that any unpaid items were charged to her family's account. The arrangement had preserved her dignity and autonomy while also addressing the store's concerns about inventory loss. The case had also led to the family's connection with resources for dementia care and support, including adult day programs that provided stimulation and supervision for Mrs. Wong while giving her adult children respite from the increasing demands of caregiving. Detective Park had documented the intervention as an example of how law enforcement could address medical and social issues that manifested as apparent criminal behavior. Sergeant Rodriguez noted the comprehensive approach that Detective Park had taken to what could have been handled as a routine arrest, demonstrating the kind of creative problem-solving that characterized the best community policing work. The case had required skills in medical assessment, family counseling, and resource coordination that went far beyond traditional law enforcement training. As the night progressed and the station settled into its quietest hours, Sergeant Rodriguez continued her review of cases that illustrated the complex social dynamics that officers encountered in their daily work. A thick file documented the patient investigation that Detective Michael Santos had conducted into what had been reported as a series of break-ins, but had actually involved much more complicated family and neighborhood relationships. The investigation had begun with reports from several residents of Oak Street about suspicious activity in and around houses that appeared to be vacant, including broken windows, missing items, and evidence that someone had been staying in empty buildings. Initial assumptions had focused on transient individuals who might be seeking shelter in abandoned properties. But Detective Santos's careful investigation had revealed a very different situation. The suspicious activity had actually involved a group of local teenagers who had been using vacant houses as gathering places during evening hours, creating what they described as social clubs where they could spend time together away from adult supervision. The teenagers had not been stealing items for profit, but had been taking things like blankets, cooking equipment, and furniture to make the abandoned spaces more comfortable for their gatherings. Asterisk. Detective Santos's reports documented his recognition that the teenagers' behavior, while technically illegal, was motivated by their lack of safe, supervised spaces where they could socialize during evening hours. The vacant houses had provided them with venues for activities that were generally harmless, but that worried parents and neighbors who observed the unusual activity without understanding its purpose, rather than simply arresting them. Teenagers for breaking and entering. Detective Santos had worked with parents, school officials, and community leaders to understand why the young people felt the need to seek out unsupervised spaces and to develop legitimate alternatives that could meet their social needs without creating legal problems or safety concerns. The resolution had involved the establishment of an evening youth program at the community center, providing supervised activities and social opportunities during the hours when the teenagers had previously been gathering in vacant houses. Detective Santos had also worked with property owners to secure abandoned buildings more effectively, while also exploring possibilities for converting some vacant spaces into legitimate community resources. The intervention had been successful in eliminating the break-ins while also creating positive opportunities for the teenagers who had been involved, several of whom had become active volunteers with the youth program that had been established in response to their needs. Detective Santos had documented the case as an example of how apparent criminal activity sometimes reflected unmet community needs that could be addressed through creative programming and resource development. Sergeant Rodriguez found these cases particularly interesting because they demonstrated the way effective police work often involved understanding the social context of apparent criminal behavior rather than simply responding to its immediate manifestations. Officers like Detective Santos had learned to look beyond the surface facts of incidents to understand the underlying factors that motivated seemingly inexplicable behavior. The quiet hours of the night shift provided ideal conditions for this kind of reflective analysis, allowing officers to review cases with the patience and attention to detail that was often impossible during the busier daytime hours. Sergeant Rodriguez had come to appreciate these peaceful periods as opportunities for the kind of thoughtful police work that addressed root causes rather than simply managing symptoms. Another case file documented the complex investigation that Detective Jennifer Kim had conducted into what had appeared to be a pattern of vandalism, but had actually involved much deeper issues related to mental health and social isolation. Someone had been creating elaborate chalk drawings on sidewalks throughout the downtown area, beautiful and intricate artworks that appeared overnight and washed away with the first rain. The drawings had been reported as vandalism by business owners who were concerned about the unauthorized use of public space. But Detective Kim's investigation had revealed that the chalk artist was creating works of genuine, artistic merit that were actually enhancing the visual appeal of the downtown area. The temporary nature of chalk meant that the drawings caused no permanent damage, while providing unexpected beauty for pedestrians and visitors. Detective Kim had approached the investigation by trying to understand the artistic and personal motivations behind the chalk drawings rather than simply focusing on their technical illegality. Her reports documented extensive efforts to locate and communicate with the artist, who turned out to be Sarah Martinez, a 23-year-old art school graduate who had been struggling with depression and social anxiety following her recent graduation. Sarah had been creating the chalk drawings as a form of therapy and self-expression, finding in the temporary art form a way to share her creativity with the community while also dealing with her feelings of isolation and uncertainty about her future. The overnight timing of her work had been motivated by her social anxiety rather than any desire to avoid detection, as she felt more comfortable creating art when fewer people were around to observe her. Detective Kim's resolution of the case had involved working with downtown business owners and city officials to establish a legitimate public art program that could provide venues for temporary artistic expression while also addressing concerns about unauthorized use of public space. Sarah had become the first participant in this program, creating sanctioned chalk art that beautified the downtown area while also serving as a model for other artists seeking opportunities for community engagement. The case had also connected Sarah with mental health resources that helped her address the depression and anxiety that had been affecting her ability to pursue professional opportunities in art and design. Detective Kim had documented the intervention as an example of how law enforcement could address mental health issues that manifested as minor legal violations while also supporting community members who were struggling with personal challenges. The success of the public art program had led to expanded opportunities for temporary artistic expression throughout the city, with rotating exhibitions of chalk art, temporary murals, and other forms of community-based creativity that enhanced the visual environment while providing outlets for artistic expression. Sarah had eventually found employment as an art instructor with community programs that brought artistic opportunities to underserved populations. As the night shift continued its quiet progression toward dawn, Sergeant Rodriguez found herself deeply moved by the creativity and compassion that these case files revealed. Story after story of officers who had recognized that their job involved far more than simple law enforcement. Each case represented hours of patient work to understand complex human situations and develop responses that addressed underlying needs rather than simply punishing violations. The steady rhythm of the night station provided the perfect environment for this kind of reflective police work, allowing officers to process the emotional and social complexity of their cases with the patience and attention that was often impossible during busier periods. The quiet hours created space for the kind of thoughtful analysis that transformed routine law enforcement into genuine community service. Sergeant Rodriguez completed her review of the evening's cases and began preparing the summary reports that would document the night shift's activities for review by day shift supervisors. Each summary captured not just the basic facts of incidents and arrests, but also the broader patterns of community needs and successful interventions that characterized the department's approach to community policing. The night station settled into its deepest quiet as the city outside moved toward dawn, with only the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional radio transmission breaking the peaceful silence that made these hours so conducive to careful, thoughtful work. In this atmosphere of calm concentration, the work of documentation continued, transforming the complex human dramas of daily police work into the ordered records that would preserve these stories for future officers who would need to understand that effective law enforcement was really about Understanding people and communities. The cases documented during these quiet hours would join the vast archive of police reports that chronicled not just crimes and arrests, but the ongoing effort to maintain social order through patience, creativity, and genuine care for community members who needed assistance during their most vulnerable moments. Each report represented a small but significant contribution to the accumulated wisdom that guided effective police work, demonstrating that the most successful interventions often involved understanding and addressing the underlying social factors that created apparent criminal behavior. As Sergeant Rodriguez completed her paperwork and prepared for the end of her shift, she felt the quiet satisfaction that came from work that contributed to something larger than individual cases or immediate problems. The night shift provided opportunities for the kind of reflective, thoughtful police work that strengthened communities by addressing root causes rather than simply managing symptoms, creating foundations of trust and communication that made neighborhoods safer and more resilient over the long term. The documentation created during these peaceful hours would outlast the individual officers who had written the reports, becoming part of the institutional memory that guided future generations of police officers in their efforts to serve and protect their communities with wisdom, compassion, and creativity. The photography archive occupied a climate-controlled vault in the basement level of the records building, where thousands of black and white images were stored in acid-free boxes that protected them from the deterioration that had claimed so many documents from earlier decades. Archive specialist Robert Chun had spent 15 years cataloging and preserving these visual records, each photograph representing a moment frozen in time when someone had deemed it important enough to document for posterity. Each box contained dozens of manila envelopes, carefully labeled with case numbers and dates that stretched back to the 1940s, when the department had first begun systematically photographing crime scenes and evidence. The images inside told stories that had once dominated local headlines but had gradually faded from public memory, becoming historical artifacts that spoke to anyone willing to listen about how the city had changed over the decades. Robert selected a box marked 1960 to 1965, miscellaneous cases, and settled into the small viewing area, where a magnifying lamp provided optimal conditions for examining fragile photographs without causing additional damage to images that were already showing signs of age. The first envelope contained photographs from what had been called the Riverside Park incident, a case that had captured public attention during the summer of 1962. The black and white images showed a small pavilion in what was then the city's newest public park, its wooden benches and picnic tables arranged in careful rows that suggested municipal pride in this new community amenity. The photographs had been taken to document vandalism that had occurred over several nights, with someone spray painting messages on the pavilion walls that had troubled city officials and prompted an investigation. Detective William Park's case notes, filed with the photographs, described the careful investigation that had revealed the vandalism was actually a form of social protest by local teenagers who felt that the new park's rules and regulations made it unwelcoming to young people from their neighborhood. The spray-painted messages had expressed frustration about curfews, restrictions on gatherings, and what the teenagers perceived as discriminatory enforcement of park regulations. The photographs documented not just the vandalism itself, but also Detective Park's methodical approach to understanding the underlying tensions that had motivated the illegal activity. Images showed him interviewing park visitors, examining the specific locations where messages had been painted, and documenting the broader social context that had created the conflict between park management and neighborhood youth. The resolution of the case was preserved in later photographs that showed the same pavilion after community meetings had led to revised park policies that better accommodated the needs of young people while maintaining order and safety. Detective Park had worked with park officials, neighborhood leaders, and the teenagers themselves to develop programming that gave young people positive roles in maintaining and improving the park. The final photographs in the envelope showed a community celebration held in the pavilion several months later, with teenagers who had originally been involved in the vandalism now serving as volunteer park guides and participating in organized activities that had transformed the space into a genuine community gathering place. The images captured the success of an approach that had addressed underlying social tensions rather than simply punishing their manifestation. Robert moved to another envelope, this one containing photographs from a case that had been front-page news during the winter of 1963. Someone had been leaving elaborate ice sculptures throughout the downtown area, beautiful frozen artworks that appeared overnight in vacant lots and empty storefronts, creating unexpected beauty in the urban landscape during the coldest months of the year. The photograph showed intricate ice formations that demonstrated considerable artistic skill, with flowing curves and detailed textures that transformed blocks of ice into works of genuine artistic merit. The images had been taken by Detective Sarah Martinez, whose investigation had approached the illegal installations as artistic expression rather than simple vandalism. Detective Martinez's case notes described her patient efforts to understand the motivations and methods behind the ice sculptures, recognizing that their temporary nature and artistic quality distinguished them from conventional vandalism or property damage. The photographs documented her investigation process, showing how she had examined each sculpture for clues about the artist's identity and techniques. The case had been resolved when Detective Martinez had connected the ice sculptures to Elena Kowalski, a 28-year-old art teacher who had been creating the installations as a way of bringing beauty to neglected urban spaces during the dreary winter months. Elena had been struggling with depression following the end of a relationship and had found in the temporary art form a way of expressing hope and creativity during a difficult period in her life. The photographs documented the creative resolution that Detective Martinez had negotiated, working with city officials and property owners to establish legitimate venues for Elena's ice sculptures while also connecting her with mental health resources and artistic opportunities that addressed her personal struggles. Elena had eventually become a prominent figure in the local arts community, using her ice sculpting skills in sanctioned festivals and community events. Robert found these older cases particularly moving because they captured a time when police work seemed to move at a more deliberate pace, allowing officers like Detective Martinez to approach unusual situations with patience and creativity rather than simply seeking the quickest resolution. The photographs preserved not just the facts of each case, but also the thoughtful process by which creative officers had found solutions that addressed underlying human needs. The next envelope contained images from what had been known as the Garden District Mystery, a case that had puzzled investigators during the spring of 1964. Someone had been secretly maintaining and improving neglected gardens throughout an older residential neighborhood, working at night to plant flowers, repair fences, and restore beauty to yards that had been abandoned as elderly residents moved away or became unable to care for their properties. The photographs showed before and after images of the improved gardens, documenting the transformation of overgrown and neglected spaces into beautiful neighborhood amenities that enhanced property values and community pride. Detective Robert Kim had been assigned to investigate what had initially been reported as trespassing and unauthorized use of private property. Detective Kim's approach had been to understand the positive impact of the mysterious gardener's work rather than simply focusing on the technical legal violations involved in working on other people's property without permission. His photographs documented the careful attention to detail that characterized the unauthorized improvements, showing that whoever was doing the work had considerable knowledge of horticulture and landscape design. The investigation had revealed that the mysterious gardener was Mrs. Rose Peterson, a retired landscape architect who had moved to the neighborhood and been disturbed by the decline of what had once been one of the city's most beautiful residential areas. Her unauthorized work had been motivated by her desire to maintain community beauty and property values rather than by any criminal intent or personal gain. The resolution had been innovative for its time, involving the establishment of a neighborhood improvement program that legitimized Mrs. Peterson's work while also providing her with liability protection and community support. Property owners had been given the opportunity to participate in the program, receiving free landscape improvements in exchange for allowing Mrs. Peterson and other volunteers to maintain their gardens. The photographs documented the success of this program in revitalizing the entire neighborhood, with property values increasing and community pride returning as residents took renewed interest in maintaining their homes and yards. Mrs. Peterson had eventually established a neighborhood gardening club that continued her work with full community support and official sanction. Robert noticed that these cases from the 1960s shared common themes about the importance of understanding individual motivations and finding creative solutions that addressed underlying social needs rather than simply enforcing regulations. The officers whose work was documented in these photographs had demonstrated remarkable patience and insight in recognizing that apparent criminal behavior often reflected positive impulses that had been misdirected due to lack of appropriate outlets. Moving forward in time, Robert selected an envelope from 1968 that contained photographs documenting what had been called the high school sit-in, a peaceful protest that had occurred when students had occupied their school building to demand changes in curriculum and disciplinary policies that they felt were unfair and discriminatory. The black and white images showed hundreds of students sitting quietly in hallways and classrooms, their faces reflecting the seriousness with which they approached their protest, while also maintaining the peaceful, nonviolent character that had distinguished their demonstration from more confrontational forms of activism occurring in other parts of the country during that turbulent period. Detective Maria Santos had been assigned to coordinate the police response to the sit-in, and her photographs documented her careful approach to a situation that could have escalated into serious conflict if handled insensitively, rather than immediately moving to arrest students or force them to leave the building. Detective Santos had worked to understand their grievances and to facilitate communication between students, school officials, and parents. The photographs showed meetings between Detective Santos and student leaders, documenting the respectful dialogue that had characterized her approach to what could have been treated as a simple matter of trespassing and disruption of educational activities. Her images captured the maturity and thoughtfulness that students had brought to their protest, demonstrating their genuine concern for educational quality rather than simple rebellion against authority. The resolution had been documented in later photographs showing the implementation of changes that addressed many of the students' concerns, including revised disciplinary procedures, expanded curriculum options, and increased student representation in school governance. Detective Santos had facilitated negotiations that had produced genuine improvements in educational quality while also maintaining respect for appropriate authority structures. The success of this approach had been preserved in follow-up photographs showing improved school climate and increased cooperation between students and administrators, demonstrating that patient dialogue and mutual respect could resolve even serious conflicts when all parties were willing to engage constructively with each other's concerns. Robert continued his exploration of the photographic archives, finding case after case that illustrated the evolution of police work toward increasingly sophisticated understanding of social dynamics and community needs. An envelope from 1970 contained images documenting what had been known as the downtown merchant conflicts, a series of disputes between established businesses and new vendors who had been setting up informal sales operations in public spaces. The photograph showed the tension that had developed as young entrepreneurs had begun selling handmade crafts, food, and other items from sidewalk locations throughout the business district, creating what established merchants viewed as unfair competition that avoided the overhead costs and regulatory requirements that formal businesses faced. Detective Linda Park had been assigned to mediate these conflicts, and her photographs documented her patient efforts to understand the concerns of both established businesses and new vendors, while also considering the interests of customers and the general public who were affected by the disputes. The images showed Detective Park meeting with representatives from both sides, facilitating discussions that revealed common interests in maintaining a vibrant downtown area while ensuring fair competition and appropriate regulation of commercial activities. Her photographs captured the complexity of balancing different stakeholder interests while also supporting economic development and entrepreneurship. The resolution had involved the establishment of a formal vendor program that provided designated spaces and appropriate regulation for street vendors, while also addressing the concerns of established businesses about unfair competition. Detective Park's photographs documented the success of this program in creating a more diverse and vibrant downtown commercial district that benefited all participants. As Robert worked his way through decades of photographic documentation, he began to see patterns in the way police work had evolved to address increasingly complex social challenges. The officers whose work was preserved in these images had consistently demonstrated creativity, patience, and genuine concern for community welfare that went far beyond traditional law enforcement responsibilities. The photographs from the 1970s and 1980s showed the development of more sophisticated approaches to community policing that recognized crime prevention as more effective than crime response, focusing on addressing underlying social conditions that contributed to disorder and conflict rather than simply responding to their symptoms after problems had already developed. An envelope from 1982 contained photographs documenting what had been called the Neighborhood Watch evolution, showing how traditional crime prevention programs had been expanded to include broader community development activities that addressed economic, social, and environmental factors contributing to neighborhood stability. The images showed Detective Michael Rodriguez working with residents to establish not just traditional security patrols, but also community gardens, youth programs, senior citizen services, and small business development initiatives that strengthen social bonds and economic opportunities in ways that made neighborhoods more resilient and less vulnerable to crime and disorder. The photographs documented the success of this comprehensive approach in reducing crime rates while also improving quality of life indicators such as property values, school performance, and community participation in civic activities. Detective Rodriguez's work had demonstrated that effective crime prevention required attention to all the factors that contributed to community health and stability. As the evening progressed and Robert continued his review of the photographic archives, he found himself deeply moved by the accumulated evidence of police officers who had understood their role as community builders rather than simply law enforcers. Each photograph preserved moments when creative officers had found ways to address human needs and social challenges through patient dialogue, resource coordination, and genuine care for community welfare. The faded images spoke to anyone willing to listen about the evolution of police work from simple law enforcement to comprehensive community service, documenting the development of approaches that prevented crime by strengthening communities rather than simply responding to criminal behavior after it had already occurred. These photographs would continue to rest quietly in their climate-controlled storage, waiting for future researchers and police officers who needed to understand that the most effective law enforcement had always involved understanding people and communities, addressing underlying social needs, and building relationships that made neighborhoods safer and more resilient over the long term. The black and white images held their secrets with quiet dignity, preserving the wisdom of officers who had learned that police work was really about serving people and building communities where everyone could thrive safely and peacefully. In their faded tones and careful composition, these photographs documented not just past events, but timeless principles about the nature of effective community service that remained as relevant today as they had been when the cameras first captured these moments of human understanding and creative problem-solving. The old downtown district retained its memories in the worn brick of buildings that had witnessed decades of human drama, their facades weathered by time but still bearing the subtle marks of events that had once commanded public attention. Urban historian Dr. Margaret Foster walked these streets during her evening research rounds, her practiced eye reading the layers of history embedded in architecture, street layouts, and the quiet spaces between buildings where significant moments had unfolded and then gradually faded into the peaceful background of city life. Each block held stories that existed now only in official records and the fading memories of longtime residents who had lived through the events that had once made headlines but had eventually been absorbed into the larger narrative of community life. Dr. Foster had spent years documenting these forgotten incidents, creating an informal map of the city that marked not just historic landmarks but also the ordinary locations where extraordinary human dramas had played out in ways that had shaped the character of neighborhoods for generations. The corner of 5th and Main Street had once been the site of what newspapers had called the protest of 1967, when a group of young activists had gathered to demonstrate against what they viewed as discriminatory hiring practices at the city's largest department store. The building that had housed the store still stood, though it now contained offices and small shops that served a very different clientele than the families who had once made weekend shopping trips to what had been the downtown area's premier retail establishment. Dr. Foster paused at the corner, consulting the small notebook where she recorded observations about how these significant locations had changed over the decades since the events that had made them briefly famous. The protest had been resolved through negotiations facilitated by Police Captain Robert Martinez, whose patient approach to crowd control and conflict mediation had prevented the demonstration from escalating into the kind of confrontation that had characterized similar events in other cities. During that turbulent period, the resolution had involved the store's agreement to establish more inclusive hiring practices while also providing opportunities for dialogue between management and community leaders about broader issues of economic opportunity and social justice. Captain Martinez had documented his approach in reports that had served as models for other departments facing similar challenges, demonstrating that patient negotiation and genuine respect for legitimate grievances could resolve even politically charged conflicts. The success of this approach had been measured not in arrests avoided or property protected, but in the long-term improvement of relationships between the business community and neighborhood residents who had felt excluded from economic opportunities. The department store had eventually become a model employer for inclusive hiring practices, while the activists who had organized the protest had found channels for ongoing dialogue with city leaders about social and economic issues. Dr. Foster walked north toward Riverside Park, where a small bridge had been the site of what local police records described as the incident of 1969. Though details about the event were found only in carefully worded official reports that suggested the situation had been more complex than any newspaper had ever reported. According to Detective Linda Park's documentation, the bridge had become a gathering place for young people who were dealing with social pressures related to the Vietnam War and changing cultural expectations. The bridge itself was unremarkable, a simple concrete span that connected two parts of the park across a narrow creek that provided drainage for the surrounding residential areas. But Detective Park's reports indicated that the location had become symbolically significant for young people who were struggling with questions about military service, social conformity, and personal identity that characterized the generational conflicts of that era. The incident had begun when several young men had gathered on the bridge to burn their draft cards in a symbolic protest against the war, an action that was both illegal and deeply controversial within a community that had strong traditions of military service and patriotic expression. The situation had been complicated by counter-protesters who had arrived to confront what they viewed as unpatriotic behavior, creating potential for serious violence between groups with fundamentally different views about civic duty and political expression. Detective Park had responded to the situation by recognizing that the underlying conflict involved sincere differences of opinion about important national issues rather than simple criminal behavior or public disorder. Her approach had been to protect the rights of both protesters and counter-protesters while also preventing the situation from escalating into physical confrontation that could have resulted in serious injuries or arrests. Resolution had involved moving both groups to separate areas of the park where they could express their views without directly confronting each other, while also arranging for community leaders to facilitate ongoing dialogue about the war and military service that allowed people with different perspectives to communicate respectfully about their disagreements. Detective Park's final reports noted that the bridge had eventually become a neutral space where young people could gather without the political tensions that had initially created problems. With informal agreements between different groups about respectful use of the location that had prevented future conflicts, the incident had demonstrated that even highly charged political disagreements could be managed through patient police work that respected legitimate rights while also maintaining public order. Dr. Foster continued her walk through the downtown area, noting how each significant location had been transformed by time from a site of conflict or crisis into a peaceful part of the urban landscape that carried its history quietly within the normal rhythms of city life. The old courthouse building had been the scene of what records described as the demonstration of 1971, when a group of women had gathered to protest what they viewed as discriminatory treatment in legal proceedings related to domestic violence and family disputes. The demonstration had been unusual for its focus on systemic issues within the criminal justice system itself, with protesters arguing that police and court responses to domestic violence were inadequate and often ignored the legitimate safety concerns of women who were seeking help from abusive relationships. The situation had been sensitive because it involved criticism of police and judicial practices by people who were seeking reform rather than simply expressing general social or political grievances. Detective Maria Santos had been assigned to manage the police response to the demonstration, and her reports reflected her recognition that the protesters were raising legitimate concerns about police practices that deserved serious consideration, rather than simply defensive responses from law enforcement. Her approach had been to facilitate dialogue between the demonstrators and department leadership about specific reforms that could improve responses to domestic violence cases. The resolution had involved significant changes in police training and procedures for handling domestic violence calls, including mandatory training about the dynamics of abusive relationships and new protocols for ensuring victim safety during investigations and prosecutions. The women who had organized the demonstration had been invited to participate in developing these reforms, creating ongoing communication between advocates and law enforcement about improving services for domestic violence victims. Success of these reforms had been documented in subsequent Reports showing improved conviction rates in domestic violence cases and increased victim satisfaction with police responses to their reports. The courthouse steps where the demonstration had occurred had become a symbol of successful collaboration between community advocates and law enforcement to improve services for vulnerable populations. Dr. Foster walked east toward the residential neighborhoods that had been the site of more personal dramas, individual cases that had required police intervention but had been resolved through the kind of patient community work that rarely attracted media attention but formed the foundation of neighborhood stability and safety. The 800 block of Elm Street had been the location of what Detective Michael Rodriguez had described as the family crisis of 1972, involving multiple generations of the same family who had been struggling with conflicts related to changing social expectations and economic pressures. The case had begun when neighbors called police about loud arguments coming from the Peterson household, where elderly grandparents, middle-aged parents, and teenage children were living together in a small house that had become overcrowded as economic difficulties had forced the extended family to share housing. The conflicts had been exacerbated by generational differences about appropriate behavior, child-rearing practices, and financial responsibilities that had created ongoing tension within the household. Detective Rodriguez had approached the situation by recognizing that the family conflicts were symptoms of larger social and economic pressures rather than personal failings or criminal behavior. His intervention had involved connecting the family with social services that could address their housing and financial needs while also providing family counseling to help different generations communicate more effectively about their expectations and concerns. The resolution had taken several months but had eventually resulted in improved housing arrangements that gave the family more space while also maintaining the mutual support that had made their living together necessary in the first place. Detective Rodriguez had documented the intervention as an example of how police work could address the social conditions that contributed to family stress and conflict rather than simply responding to their symptoms after problems had already escalated. The Peterson house still stood among its neighbors, indistinguishable from the other modest homes on the block except to someone who knew its history as a place where patient police work had prevented family crisis from escalating into more serious problems that might have resulted in arrests, family separation, or ongoing neighborhood disturbance. Moving through the residential neighborhoods, Dr. Foster noted how many locations held similar stories of quiet police interventions that had addressed problems before they became crises, creating a foundation of community stability that was invisible to casual observers, but essential to neighborhood safety and quality of life. The small commercial district on Maple Avenue had been the site of what Detective Sarah Kim had called the merchant conflict of 1974, involving disputes between established businesses and newer enterprises that had created tension within the local business community. The conflict had begun when several young entrepreneurs had opened businesses that competed directly with established merchants while also introducing new approaches to customer service and marketing that had attracted customers away from traditional stores. The established merchants had complained that the new businesses were not following accepted business practices and were creating unfair competitive pressures that threatened the stability of the local commercial district. Detective Kim had been called to investigate complaints about various minor violations and disputes between businesses, but her reports indicated that she had recognized the underlying conflict as a normal part of economic change rather than criminal behavior requiring law enforcement intervention. Her approach had been to facilitate dialogue between established and newer businesses, about ways they could coexist and even collaborate to strengthen the overall commercial district. The resolution had involved the establishment of a merchant association that brought together all the businesses in the area to coordinate marketing efforts, address common concerns about parking and customer service, and develop policies for resolving disputes without requiring police intervention. Detective Kim had helped organize this association and had provided ongoing consultation about conflict resolution and community relations. The success of this approach had been evident in the long-term prosperity of the commercial district, which had become known for its diversity of businesses and collaborative approach to serving customers. The Merchant Association had continued to operate for decades, preventing many potential conflicts and creating a model for business cooperation that had been adopted by commercial districts throughout the city. Dr. Foster walked back toward the downtown area as evening settled over the city, observing how the accumulated effects of countless small police interventions had shaped the character of neighborhoods in ways that were apparent only to someone who understood the history of places that appeared ordinary but had been the sites of significant human dramas that had been resolved through patient, creative police work. The old railroad bridge on the eastern edge of downtown had been the location of what Detective Jennifer Martinez had documented as the crisis of 1976, when a young man struggling with depression and family problems had threatened to harm himself in a dramatic gesture that had required careful intervention to resolve safely. The incident had brought together police officers, family members, community leaders, and mental health professionals in a coordinated response that had demonstrated the importance of treating mental health crises as medical emergencies rather than criminal justice matters. Detective Martinez had coordinated the response by recognizing that the young man's behavior was a cry for help rather than a criminal act, requiring compassionate intervention and appropriate resources rather than arrest and prosecution. Her approach had involved patient dialogue with the individual while also coordinating with mental health professionals who could provide immediate crisis counseling and longer-term treatment resources. The resolution had been successful in connecting the young man with mental health services that had addressed his depression and family conflicts, while also providing his family with education and support for dealing with mental health issues. Detective Martinez had documented the intervention as a model for police response to mental health crises that prioritized treatment and support over criminal justice measures. The bridge had later become a symbol of successful mental health intervention within the community, with local mental health advocates organizing annual events there to raise awareness about depression and suicide prevention. The location had been transformed from a site of crisis into a place of hope and community support for people struggling with mental health challenges. As Dr. Foster completed her evening walk through the city's archive of memories, she reflected on how these ordinary places had been shaped by extraordinary moments, when police officers had chosen compassion over enforcement, understanding over judgment, and creative problem-solving over routine responses. Each location held stories of human crisis that had been resolved through patient work that addressed underlying needs rather than simply managing symptoms. The city itself had become a repository of institutional wisdom about effective community policing, with every street corner and neighborhood holding lessons about how patient, creative police work could strengthen communities and prevent crime by addressing the social conditions that contributed to conflict and disorder. These lessons lived on in the places themselves, available to anyone who took the time to understand the history embedded in the urban landscape. The gentle echoes of these resolved crises continued to resonate through the neighborhoods they had touched, creating a foundation of community resilience that made the city safer and more stable than crime statistics alone could measure. In the quiet spaces between buildings and the peaceful rhythms of neighborhood life, The accumulated wisdom of decades of community policing continued to shape the character of a city that had learned to remember its troubles as stories of healing rather than sources of ongoing division or fear. The streets held their memories with quiet dignity, preserving the knowledge that effective police work was really about understanding people and places, about finding creative solutions to complex problems, and about building relationships that made communities stronger and more resilient over the long term. In the gentle twilight that settled over these familiar places, the city itself served as a testament to the transformative power of police work that was guided by wisdom, compassion, and genuine commitment to community service. The final archive room existed in the deepest level of the records complex, where the oldest and most completely resolved cases found their permanent rest in climate-controlled silence that would preserve them for generations yet to come. Senior archivist Catherine Walsh had overseen the transfer of thousands of case files to this ultimate repository, where investigations that had once consumed months or years of active police work now rested in the perfect order that marked their transition from active concerns to historical memory. Each filing cabinet in this room contained cases that had reached what the department classified as final closure, meaning not only that the legal proceedings had been completed, but that all follow-up requirements had been satisfied, all appeals exhausted, and all community impacts resolved to the satisfaction of everyone involved. These files represented the gold standard of police work. Investigations that had been so thoroughly and thoughtfully conducted that they had created lasting peace rather than simply ending immediate problems. Catherine moved slowly through the rows of cabinets, her footsteps muffled by the deep carpet that absorbed sound and created an atmosphere of profound quiet that seemed appropriate for this sanctuary of completed stories. Each file in this room had earned its place through the quality of the police work it documented and the lasting positive impact it had created within the community it had touched. The first cabinet she opened contained cases from the 1980s that had been designated for final archival status because they represented exemplary models of community policing that had created lasting improvements in neighborhood safety and social cohesion. The thick folder at the front of the drawer documented what had been called the Hillside Neighborhood Transformation Project, a comprehensive approach to addressing multiple social problems that had been creating ongoing crime and disorder in a residential area that had been struggling with economic decline and social fragmentation. Detective Lieutenant Maria Rodriguez had coordinated this project over a period of 3 years, working with residents, community organizations, and social service agencies to address not just specific crimes but the underlying conditions that were making the neighborhood vulnerable to ongoing problems. Her final report, filed at the completion of the project, documented a systematic approach that had transformed one of the city's most troubled areas into a stable, thriving community. The transformation had begun with careful analysis of crime patterns and their relationship to social and economic factors affecting the neighborhood. Detective Rodriguez had identified specific locations where crimes occurred most frequently and had worked to understand the environmental and social factors that made these areas attractive to criminal activity. Her approach had been to address these factors systematically rather than simply increasing patrol presence or making more arrests. Intervention had involved coordinating multiple agencies and community organizations to address problems ranging from abandoned buildings and poor lighting to lack of youth programming and limited economic opportunities for residents. Detective Rodriguez had served as a central coordinator for this comprehensive effort, ensuring that different interventions reinforced each other and that progress was measured in terms of long-term community improvement rather than short-term crime reduction. The success of the project had been documented through multiple measures, including significant reductions in crime rates, increased property values, improved school performance, and enhanced community participation in civic activities. More importantly, the project had created lasting, institutional changes that continued to support neighborhood stability long after the formal intervention had been completed. Final report included letters from dozens of residents expressing gratitude for the patient, comprehensive work that had transformed their neighborhood from a place they had been planning to leave into a community where they were proud to raise their families. Detective Rodriguez had concluded her documentation by noting that the project had demonstrated the importance of addressing root causes of crime rather than simply responding to their symptoms. Catherine moved to another section of the cabinet, finding a case that had been archived because it represented an innovative approach to addressing juvenile crime that had created a national model for youth intervention programming. The case had begun in 1987 when Detective James Park had been assigned to investigate a series of petty crimes committed by a group of middle school students who had been engaging in shoplifting, vandalism, and truancy that was disrupting both their education and the broader community. Detective Park's investigation had revealed that the criminal behavior was largely motivated by boredom and lack of positive opportunities for engagement rather than by serious antisocial attitudes or family problems. The students involved were generally from stable homes and had previously been successful in school, suggesting that their criminal behavior was more of a developmental phase than an indication of long-term problems. Rather than processing the students through the traditional juvenile justice system, Detective Park had worked with school administrators, parents, and community organizations to develop an alternative intervention that addressed the underlying needs that were motivating the problematic behavior. The approach had been based on research suggesting that young people who engaged in meaningful, challenging activities were less likely to seek excitement through criminal behavior. The intervention had involved the creation of what was called the Community Service Academy, a program that provided middle school students with opportunities to engage in real community improvement projects while also developing leadership skills and civic awareness. Students who had been involved in criminal behavior were given the opportunity to participate in this program as an alternative to formal prosecution, while other students could participate voluntarily. Detective Park had worked with local organizations to identify community improvement projects that were appropriate for young people while also providing genuine value to the community. Students had worked on projects ranging from park maintenance and elderly assistance to community gardening and environmental improvement, giving them opportunities to see the positive impact of their efforts while also building relationships with adult mentors. The success of the Community Service Academy had been documented through multiple measures, including elimination of juvenile crime among participants, improved academic performance, and increased civic engagement that continued into their high school years. The program had been so successful that it had been adopted by school districts throughout the region and had served as a model for juvenile crime prevention programs nationally. The final documentation included follow-up studies tracking participants over a 10-year period, showing that young people who had participated in the Community Service Academy had significantly lower rates of adult criminal behavior and higher rates of civic participation compared to similar populations who had been processed through traditional juvenile justice systems. Catherine continued her exploration of the final archive, finding case after case that represented the highest standards of police work and community service. A comprehensive file documented what had been known as the Downtown Revitalization Initiative, a collaborative effort between police, business leaders, and community organizations that had transformed a deteriorating commercial district into a thriving cultural and economic center. Detective Captain Sarah Chun had led the police component of this initiative, working to address the complex relationship between crime, economic decline, and social disorder that had been creating a cycle of deterioration in what had once been the city's premier shopping and entertainment district. Her approach had been to understand crime as both a cause and a consequence of economic and social problems rather than simply as a law enforcement issue. The initiative had involved comprehensive analysis of how different factors contributed to the district's problems, including the relationship between vacant buildings and crime, the impact of poor lighting and maintenance on public safety, and the role of economic opportunity in preventing crime and disorder. Detective Chun had coordinated with urban planners, economic development specialists, and social service providers to develop a comprehensive response that addressed all these factors simultaneously. The intervention had included physical improvements such as enhanced lighting and landscaping. Economic development initiatives had attracted new businesses and provided employment opportunities, and programming that brought positive activities and community events to areas that had previously been dominated by crime and disorder. Detective Chun's documentation showed that the initiative had been successful in creating lasting improvements in both crime rates and economic activity, with the downtown district eventually becoming a regional destination for shopping, dining, and cultural activities. The success had been attributed to the comprehensive approach that had addressed multiple factors simultaneously, rather than focusing on any single intervention. The final report included economic impact studies showing significant increases in property values, business revenues, and employment opportunities, along with community satisfaction surveys indicating that residents viewed the downtown district as safe and welcoming for the first time in decades. Detective Chun had concluded that the initiative had demonstrated the importance of understanding crime within its broader social and economic context. As Catherine worked her way deeper into the final archives, she found herself moved by the accumulated evidence of police work that had created lasting, positive change in communities throughout the city. Each file represented not just the resolution of immediate problems, but the creation of conditions that continued to support community safety and well-being long after the original interventions had been completed. The files from the 1990s showed the evolution of community policing toward even more sophisticated approaches that integrated crime prevention with comprehensive community development. A thick folder documented the Neighborhood Partnership Program, an initiative that had brought together police officers, residents, and service providers in ongoing collaborative relationships that addressed community needs before they developed into crime problems. Detective Commander Robert Martinez had developed this program based on recognition that the most effective crime prevention involved building strong community relationships that made neighborhoods resilient to crime and disorder. His approach had been to assign officers to work long-term with specific neighborhoods, allowing them to develop deep understanding of community dynamics and to build trust relationships that made early intervention possible. The program had involved regular community meetings where residents could discuss concerns and work with police officers to develop collaborative responses to emerging problems. Officers had been trained in community development techniques and had worked with residents to strengthen social networks, improve physical environments, and address economic and social factors that contributed to crime vulnerability. The success of the Neighborhood Partnership Program had been documented through sustained reductions in crime rates, increased community participation in civic activities, and improved relationships between police and residents that had made law enforcement more effective when formal intervention was necessary. The program had become a permanent part of department operations and had been recognized nationally as a model for community policing. Catherine found that the most recent files in the final archive represented the culmination of decades of evolution in police work toward comprehensive community service that addressed crime through building healthy, resilient communities. These cases demonstrated that the most effective law enforcement involved understanding and addressing the social conditions that made crime possible, rather than simply responding to criminal behavior after it occurred. The final section of the archive contained what were classified as legacy cases, investigations that had had such profound positive impact on communities that they continued to influence police work and community development decades after their completion. These files were consulted regularly by officers and community leaders who needed to understand how patient, creative police work could address complex social problems. One such legacy case documented the resolution of what had been called the East Side Crisis of 1995, when a combination of economic problems, social tensions, and environmental issues had created conditions that threatened to destabilize an entire section of the city. The comprehensive police response had involved coordination with multiple agencies and community organizations over a period of 2 years, creating lasting improvements in community safety and quality of life. Detective Chief Linda Park had coordinated this effort, working to address everything from housing problems and unemployment to family conflicts and youth development needs that were contributing to crime and social disorder. Her approach had been based on understanding that effective crime prevention required addressing all the factors that made communities vulnerable to criminal activity. The intervention had been successful in creating lasting improvements in economic opportunity, social cohesion, and community safety that had continued to benefit residents for decades after the formal program had ended. The area had eventually become one of the city's most stable and prosperous neighborhoods, with low crime rates and high levels of community participation in civic activities. As Catherine completed her review of the final archive, she reflected on how these completed cases represented the accumulated wisdom of generations of police officers who had understood that their work was fundamentally about building and maintaining healthy communities where all residents could thrive safely. Each file documented not just the resolution of specific problems, but the creation of knowledge and approaches that continued to guide effective police work. The silence in the final archive room was complete now, broken only by the soft whisper of air circulation that maintained optimal conditions for preserving these important documents. In this profound quiet, the stories held in these files rested peacefully, their dramas resolved and their lessons preserved for future generations of officers and community leaders who would need to understand that police work at its best was really about understanding people and building communities. The final files would remain here indefinitely, their pages yellowing slowly despite the careful climate control, their stories gradually fading into the historical record, where they would join the countless other human dramas that had been resolved through patience, wisdom, and genuine care for community welfare. In their ordered silence, these documents represented the ultimate goal of all police work, the creation of communities where people could live together safely and peacefully, where problems were addressed before they became crises, and where the work of law enforcement had succeeded so completely that it was no longer needed. Catherine switched off the lights in the final archive room and sealed the door behind her, leaving the completed cases to their eternal rest in the deepest quiet of institutional memory. The stories would sleep now, their work done, their lessons preserved, their peace finally and completely established in the gentle rhythm of silence that marked the end of all human stories and the beginning of perfect, dreamless rest. Asterisk. The old courthouse building stood in stately silence on the corner of 3rd and Judicial Streets, its limestone facade weathered by decades of seasons, but still maintaining the dignified presence that had marked it as the center of legal proceedings for more than 60 years. Building Superintendent James Morrison walked these corridors during his evening rounds, his keys jangling softly against the silence that filled the empty courtrooms and chambers, where countless human dramas had been resolved through the careful application of law and compassion. Each courtroom held its own character, shaped by the particular style of the judges who had presided there, and the types of cases that had been heard within their oak-paneled walls. Courtroom 3 had been the domain of Judge Patricia Santos for nearly 2 decades, and her approach to criminal justice had left an indelible mark on the space that still seemed to echo with her patient voice and careful consideration of every case that had come before her bench. The wooden pews where families and observers had sat during proceedings were arranged in perfect rows, their worn surfaces polished smooth by the hands of countless people who had waited anxiously for verdicts that would determine the course of lives and relationships. The judge's bench, elevated slightly above the courtroom floor, maintained its position of quiet authority even in the absence of proceedings, its empty chair facing the witness stand where truth had been sought and found through testimony that revealed the complex circumstances surrounding human conflict and crime. James paused in the doorway of courtroom 3, remembering some of the cases he had witnessed during his years maintaining the building. Judge Santos had been known for her thorough approach to understanding not just the legal facts of cases, but the social and personal circumstances that had led to criminal behavior, often spending considerable time exploring opportunities for rehabilitation and community service, rather than simply imposing sentences that focused solely on punishment. One case that had particularly impressed James had involved a young man named Marcus Chen, who had been charged with vandalism after spray painting murals on several downtown buildings without permission. Rather than simply fining Marcus or sentencing him to jail time, Judge Santos had taken time to understand his artistic motivations and his desire to contribute something positive to the community that he felt had limited opportunities for young people to express their creativity. The resolution had been innovative, involving Marcus's participation in a community service program that allowed him to create legitimate public art while also learning about appropriate venues for artistic expression and the importance of respecting property rights. Judge Santos had worked with local art organizations to establish mentorship opportunities that channeled Marcus's talent into positive community involvement. The case had been resolved with Marcus completing a large mural for the community center, working under the supervision of established artists who helped him develop both his technical skills and his understanding of how art could serve positive social purposes. The courtroom had witnessed his return several months later, not for sentencing but for recognition of his successful completion of the program and his ongoing contribution to community arts programming. James moved through the courthouse corridors toward courtroom 1, which had been the setting for more serious criminal cases during Judge Michael Rodriguez's tenure. The larger courtroom had been designed to accommodate the expanded proceedings required for felony cases, with additional seating for juries and space for the more complex legal procedures that characterized serious criminal prosecutions. Despite handling more serious crimes, Judge Rodriguez had maintained the same commitment to understanding individual circumstances and seeking resolutions that served both justice and community welfare. James recalled cases where the judge had taken considerable time to understand the backgrounds of defendants and to explore sentencing options that addressed underlying problems, while also protecting community safety. One particularly memorable case had involved a woman named Sarah Martinez who had been charged with embezzlement after taking money from her employer to pay for medical treatment for her seriously ill child. The case had required Judge Rodriguez to balance the legitimate concern about theft and breach of trust with understanding of the desperate circumstances that had motivated the criminal behavior. The resolution had involved restitution payments that allowed Sarah to repay the stolen money over time while also participating in financial counseling that helped her develop better strategies for managing family crises without resorting to illegal activities. Judge Rodriguez had also worked with social service agencies to connect the family with resources for medical expenses that had contributed to their financial crisis. The courtroom had witnessed Sarah's return for several progress hearings, documenting her successful compliance with restitution requirements and her participation in community service that had allowed her to maintain employment, while also making amends for her criminal behavior. The case had demonstrated how the legal system could address crime in ways that repaired harm, while also addressing underlying social problems. James descended to the basement level of the courthouse, where a series of holding cells had once been, used for defendants awaiting hearings or transferring between the courthouse and the county jail. The cells had been empty for several years since the construction of a new judicial complex with more modern facilities, but they maintained their somber presence as reminders of the human cost of crime and the importance of justice in maintaining social order. Each cell contained only the basic amenities required for temporary detention, with sturdy benches and minimal fixtures that spoke to their purely functional purpose. But James had observed over the years that even these stark spaces had sometimes served as places of reflection and transformation for people who were facing the consequences of their actions and considering how they might rebuild their lives. The cells had witnessed countless conversations between defendants and their attorneys, family members, and spiritual advisors, who had provided support and guidance during what were often the most difficult periods in people's lives. James had sometimes overheard discussions about rehabilitation programs, family reconciliation, and plans for reintegration into community life that demonstrated the human capacity for growth and change, even in the most challenging circumstances. One cell had been the setting for a conversation that James had found particularly moving, involving a young father named David Park, who had been arrested for drug possession and was facing potential incarceration that would separate him from his infant daughter. The conversation had been between David and his older brother, a social worker who had come to discuss treatment options and family support that might provide alternatives to imprisonment. The brother had explained various rehabilitation programs that were available and had worked with David to develop a plan for addressing his addiction issues while maintaining his relationship with his daughter and his responsibilities as a parent. The cell had become a place of hope rather than despair as the family developed strategies for addressing the problems that had led to David's arrest. The case had eventually been resolved through a treatment court program that allowed David to participate in intensive drug rehabilitation while living at home and maintaining supervised contact with his daughter. The basement cell where he had faced his darkest moment had become the starting point for a recovery process that had eventually reunited his family and restored his role as a responsible parent. James climbed back to the main floor of the courthouse and walked toward the administrative offices where court records were maintained and legal proceedings were supported by the clerical staff who ensured that all documentation was properly filed and preserved. These offices had been the behind-the-scenes foundation of the courthouse's operations, where the meticulous attention to detail required by the legal system was maintained through careful record-keeping and administrative support. The records office contained thousands of case files documenting decades of legal proceedings, each one representing a human story that had been resolved through the application of law and the careful consideration of judges, attorneys, and court staff who had worked to ensure that justice was served fairly and compassionately. The files were arranged in perfect order, creating an archive of community legal history that demonstrated the evolution of criminal justice approaches over time. James had observed how the cases from earlier decades reflected different approaches to criminal justice, with more emphasis on punishment and deterrence, while more recent cases showed increased focus on rehabilitation and addressing underlying social problems that contributed to criminal behavior. The transition reflected broader social changes and improved understanding of effective approaches to reducing crime and supporting community safety. The records also documented the important role that community support and family involvement played in successful criminal justice outcomes, with cases showing better results when defendants had strong social networks and access to employment, housing, and treatment resources that supported their reintegration into law-abiding community life. James walked through the courthouse library, where legal research had been conducted for decades before the advent of computerized legal databases. The shelves still held bound volumes of legal precedents and statutes that had guided judicial decisions, their leather bindings worn smooth by the hands of attorneys and judges who had sought guidance from past cases in making decisions about current legal challenges. The library had been a place of quiet study and careful consideration, where complex legal questions had been researched and analyzed to ensure that court decisions were based on solid legal foundation and appropriate consideration of relevant precedents. The peaceful atmosphere had been conducive to the thoughtful analysis required for fair and just legal proceedings. James remembered seeing Judge Santos spending long hours in the library, researching sentencing options and rehabilitation programs that might be appropriate for specific defendants, demonstrating her commitment to finding solutions that served both legal requirements and community welfare. Her careful preparation had been evident in court proceedings, where she had been able to offer defendants realistic alternatives to traditional sentencing that addressed their individual circumstances and needs. The library had also been used by defense attorneys who were seeking creative solutions for their clients, researching precedents for alternative sentencing and rehabilitation programs that might provide better outcomes than traditional imprisonment. The collaborative atmosphere had encouraged innovative approaches to criminal justice that had benefited both defendants and the broader community. Moving to the upper floor of the courthouse, James entered the chambers where judges had conducted the private meetings and conferences that were essential parts of legal proceedings. These offices had been the settings for plea negotiations, sentencing conferences, and other discussions that required privacy and careful consideration away from the public proceedings in the courtrooms below. Judge Rodriguez's chambers had been furnished with the dignity appropriate to judicial office while also maintaining a welcoming atmosphere for the sensitive conversations that were often necessary in criminal cases. The office had been the setting for meetings between judges, attorneys, defendants, and family members who were working to develop resolutions that served justice while also addressing the human needs of everyone involved. James recalled observing meetings where judges had worked with families to understand the impact of criminal behavior on victims and communities while also considering the circumstances that had led to criminal behavior and the potential for rehabilitation and restitution. These private conferences had often been more productive than formal court proceedings in developing creative solutions that addressed complex human situations. The chambers had also been used for meetings with probation officers, social workers, and treatment professionals who provided information about defendants, progress in rehabilitation programs, and their readiness for increased responsibility and community involvement. These collaborative discussions had been essential for making informed decisions about sentencing and supervision that balanced community protection with opportunities for individual growth and change. As James completed his evening rounds through the empty courthouse, he reflected on how the building itself had served as more than just a venue for legal proceedings. The courthouse had been a place where justice was sought and found through the patient application of law and the careful consideration of individual circumstances that recognized the complexity of human behavior and the potential for positive change. The empty courtrooms and chambers now held the silence of completed work. Their proceedings concluded and their cases resolved through the collaborative efforts of judges, attorneys, court staff, and community members who had worked together to ensure that justice was served fairly and compassionately. The building had witnessed countless human dramas that had been transformed through legal proceedings into opportunities for healing, growth, and community restoration. The iron doors that had once echoed with the footsteps of defendants, attorneys, and court staff now stood silent, their work completed, and their purpose fulfilled through decades of service to justice and community welfare. In their quiet dignity, these spaces preserved the memory of human conflicts that had been resolved through patient, legal processes that had sought truth, provided accountability, and created opportunities for positive change. James locked the courthouse doors behind him and walked into the evening air, leaving the building to its peaceful rest. Inside, the empty corridors and chambers held their stories with quiet dignity, preserving the memory of countless cases that had been resolved through the careful application of law and compassion that had served both individual justice and community welfare. The courthouse would stand through the night in stately silence, its limestone walls holding the accumulated wisdom of decades of legal proceedings that had demonstrated how justice could be served through understanding rather than simple punishment, through rehabilitation rather than mere retribution, and through community healing rather than divisive conflict. In the gentle darkness that settled over the building, the courthouse rested peacefully, its work completed and its stories preserved in the quiet, echoes of voices that had once sought truth and found resolution within its dignified chambers. The empty courtrooms held their silence like a prayer, maintaining their sacred purpose even in the absence of active proceedings, ready to serve justice again when needed while preserving the memory of all the human dramas that had been resolved within their oak-paneled walls. The Beyond Archive existed in a space that was not quite physical and not quite metaphysical, accessible only to those who had spent so many years among the documented stories of human conflict and resolution, that they had developed an almost mystical connection to the patterns that governed how all disputes eventually found their way to peace. Chief Archivist Emeritus Dr. Eleanor Mason had discovered this space quite by accident during her final week of service, when 43 years of cataloging, preserving, and studying police records had suddenly revealed to her the deeper truth that lay beneath all the individual cases she had witnessed. In this space, beyond the physical archives, every story that had ever been resolved continued to exist in a state of perfect completion. Their conflicts transformed into understanding, their chaos refined into wisdom, their human drama elevated into something approaching the sacred. Dr. Mason moved through this realm with the slow, reverent pace of someone who had finally understood that her life's work had not been about organizing documents but about participating in the gradual transformation of human suffering into collective wisdom. Here, the distinction between different cases, different decades, different types of crimes had dissolved into a unified understanding of the single, eternal story that underlied all human conflict, the story of people learning to live together peacefully, of communities developing the wisdom to address problems before they became crises, of justice evolving from punishment toward healing, of law enforcement transforming from control toward service. The first presence she encountered in this space was the accumulated essence of all the juvenile cases she had processed over the decades. Thousands of young people who had made mistakes and been given opportunities to learn and grow rather than being condemned for their errors. These cases had merged into a single luminous understanding of human potential and the importance of responding to youthful mistakes with patience and education rather than harsh punishment. She could feel the presence of Maria Santos, the teenager who had created illegal murals in 1967 and had been guided into legitimate artistic expression through Detective Chin's patient intervention. Maria's story had blended with those of countless other young artists, vandals, shoplifters, and rule breakers who had been helped to understand that their impulses toward expression, independence, and testing boundaries were natural parts of human development that could be channeled into positive directions with appropriate guidance and support. The juvenile cases whispered their collective wisdom about the importance of seeing potential rather than just problems, of understanding that most young people who engaged in minor criminal behavior were not future career criminals, but simply individuals who needed help learning appropriate ways to express their energy, creativity, and desire for autonomy. The accumulated knowledge of decades of successful interventions had crystallized into clear principles about effective youth programming and the crucial role of community support in guiding young people toward productive adulthood. Dr. Mason moved deeper into this realm of completed understanding, encountering the merged presence of all the family crisis cases that had been resolved through patient community policing over the decades. These cases had combined into a profound understanding of the complex dynamics that governed family relationships and the ways that external stresses could create internal conflicts that required careful intervention to prevent escalation into serious problems. She felt the presence of the Henderson family from the missing teenager case, the Morrison family dealing with multi-generational care issues, the Rodriguez family struggling with economic pressures, and hundreds of other families who had been helped through difficult periods by officers who understood that family conflicts were often symptoms of larger social problems rather than personal failures or character defects. The family cases had achieved a collective understanding of the importance of addressing underlying stresses rather than simply managing their symptoms, of providing resources and support that strengthened family bonds rather than simply enforcing rules and regulations. The accumulated wisdom emphasized the crucial role that stable families played in community safety and the importance of helping families develop the communication skills and resource networks they needed to handle crises without requiring emergency intervention. Moving further into this space of eternal resolution, Dr. Mason encountered the presence of all the mental health-related cases that had been handled with compassion and understanding rather than simple law enforcement approaches. These cases had merged into a clear understanding of the relationship between mental health and criminal behavior, and the importance of treating mental health crises as medical emergencies rather than criminal justice matters. The presence included Mrs. Wong with her dementia-related shoplifting, David Morrison with his unemployment-related anxiety, Sarah Martinez with her depression-related illegal art, and countless others who had been connected with appropriate treatment and support rather than being processed through systems that were designed to address willful criminal behavior rather than symptoms of illness or disability. These cases had achieved collective wisdom about the importance of training police officers to recognize mental health symptoms and to respond with appropriate resources rather than enforcement actions. The accumulated knowledge emphasized the crucial role that mental health services played in crime prevention and the importance of collaboration between law enforcement and medical professionals in addressing the complex intersection of mental health and public safety. In the deepest part of this realm, Dr. Mason encountered the presence of all the cases that had involved economic stress and its relationship to criminal behavior. These cases had combined into a profound understanding of how poverty, unemployment, housing insecurity, and other economic pressures created conditions that made criminal behavior more likely while also making it more difficult for people to access the resources they needed to address problems before they became crises. She felt the presence of Mrs. Peterson stealing food to survive, the young people using vacant buildings as social spaces because they had no other options, the families struggling with medical expenses that had depleted their resources, and countless others who had engaged in illegal behavior not because of moral deficiency, but because of economic desperation or lack of legal alternatives. These cases had achieved collective understanding of the importance of addressing economic inequality and lack of opportunity as crime prevention measures, recognizing that communities with strong economic foundations and adequate social safety nets were much less likely to experience high rates of criminal behavior. The accumulated wisdom emphasized the crucial role that economic justice played in public safety, and the importance of police officers understanding and addressing the social conditions that contributed to criminal behavior. Dr. Mason found herself in the presence of all the cases involving community conflict and the importance of mediation and dialogue in resolving disputes before they escalated into criminal behavior. These cases had merged into a clear understanding of how patient communication and mutual respect could resolve even serious conflicts when all parties were willing to engage constructively with each other's concerns and needs. The presence included the downtown business conflicts, the neighborhood noise disputes, the generational conflicts about appropriate behavior and social expectations, and countless other situations where people with legitimate but conflicting needs had been helped to find solutions that respected everyone's rights while also maintaining community harmony. These cases had achieved collective wisdom about the importance of police officers serving as mediators and community builders rather than simply law enforcers, recognizing that many situations that came to police attention required communication and resource coordination rather than arrest and prosecution. The accumulated knowledge emphasized the crucial role that conflict resolution skills played in effective community policing and the importance of addressing underlying tensions before they escalated into serious problems. In this space beyond physical archives, Dr. Mason encountered the presence of all the officers whose patient, creative work had been documented in the thousands of cases she had processed over her career. These officers had merged into a collective understanding of what effective police work really meant, serving as community healers and problem solvers, rather than simply enforcers of rules and regulations. She felt the presence of Detective Chun with his patient approach to juvenile crime, Officer Park with her skillful mediation of family conflicts, Detective Rodriguez with his innovative economic development approaches, Detective Santos with her sensitive handling of mental health crises, and countless others who had understood that their job was fundamentally about helping people and strengthening communities. These officers had achieved collective wisdom about the importance of understanding individual circumstances and addressing underlying causes rather than simply responding to symptoms, of building relationships and trust that made early intervention possible, of collaborating with other professionals and community organizations to provide comprehensive responses to complex social problems. As Dr. Mason reached the center of this realm of completed understanding, she found herself in the presence of something that could only be described as the accumulated wisdom of human community itself. The collective knowledge that had been gained through centuries of people learning to live together peacefully and to address conflicts through dialogue and mutual support rather than violence and domination. This presence encompassed not just the specific cases she had studied, but the eternal human story of gradually learning to transform conflict into cooperation, punishment into healing, fear into understanding, division into community. Every resolved case had contributed to this larger understanding, adding its small piece to the vast puzzle of human wisdom about living together, peacefully and supporting each other during times of crisis and need. In this final presence, Dr. Mason understood that her life's work had been part of something much larger than she had ever imagined. That every carefully cataloged case file had been a contribution to humanity's ongoing effort to understand itself and to develop more effective ways of addressing the inevitable conflicts and challenges that arose when people lived together in communities. The accumulated wisdom whispered its eternal truths about the importance of patience and understanding, about the power of compassion to transform even the most difficult situations, about the crucial role that every individual played in maintaining the delicate balance that made civilized life possible, about the ultimate truth that all human conflicts could be resolved through patient application of wisdom, kindness, and genuine care for the welfare of all community members. Dr. Mason felt herself becoming part of this eternal understanding, her decades of service to justice and community welfare merging with the accumulated wisdom of countless others who had dedicated their lives to the patient work of building and maintaining peaceful human communities. Her individual identity began to fade into the larger story of human wisdom and community service, her personal experiences becoming part of the eternal archive of knowledge about effective approaches to justice and conflict resolution. In this space beyond the final archive, there was no more need for individual cases or specific interventions, no more requirement for documentation or preservation of particular stories. All the human dramas that had been carefully recorded and cataloged had achieved their ultimate purpose by contributing to the larger understanding of how communities could function most effectively and how justice could be served through wisdom rather than simple enforcement. The profound silence that filled this space was not empty, but full, containing within itself all the voices that had ever been raised in seeking justice, all the solutions that had ever been found to human conflicts, all the wisdom that had ever been gained through patient observation and careful intervention in situations where people needed help learning to live together peacefully. Dr. Mason allowed herself to be absorbed into this eternal silence, her consciousness merging with the accumulated wisdom of centuries of community service and conflict resolution. Her individual story became part of the larger story of human wisdom, her personal experiences contributing to the eternal understanding that would guide future generations in their ongoing work of building and maintaining just and compassionate communities. In the final moment before complete merger with this eternal understanding, Dr. Mason felt a profound peace settle over her. The deep satisfaction that came from understanding that her life's work had contributed to something infinitely larger and more important than she had ever imagined. Every case file she had cataloged, every story she had preserved, every pattern she had recognized had been part of humanity's ongoing effort to understand itself and to develop more effective approaches to living together peacefully and supporting each other through all the challenges and opportunities that mark the human experience. The space beyond the final archive settled into its eternal quiet, holding within its profound silence all the stories that had ever been told about human conflict and resolution, all the wisdom that had ever been gained about effective community service and conflict resolution, all the hope that had ever been invested in the possibility that people could learn to live together peacefully and support each other during times of need and crisis. In this ultimate silence, every story had found its perfect rest. Every conflict had achieved its complete resolution. Every lesson had been learned and preserved for future generations, who would need to understand that the work of justice and community service was eternal, requiring each generation to learn anew the patient skills of understanding, compassion, and creative problem-solving that made civilized life possible and peaceful human communities achievable.